Welcome. If this is your first night here, good. You found the right place. Dark Horror Narrations is where first-person encounters live. Real terrain, real gear, real incidents that the people who experience them still can't fully explain. No actors, no sound effects, just the account told as plainly and as accurately as the narrator could manage, and whatever feeling settles into you when you listen in the dark. Tonight's compilation comes out of Alaska. 10 encounters. 10 different people, 10 different corners of that state, the river systems, the mountain corridors, the highways, the fishing grounds, the deep backcountry where the nearest road is days away, and the radio is the only thing connecting you to anyone who could help. Before we begin, drop a comment. I want to know, if you had to spend a single night alone somewhere in Alaska, where would you go? And where would you refuse to go, no matter what anyone offered you? I read every comment. I'll see you at the end of the last story. Let's get into it. Story 1. The Kenai Mimic. The man on the opposite bank was wearing my rain jacket. I hadn't taken it off. I want you to sit with that for a second before I tell you the rest of it, because when it happened, I didn't have the luxury of sitting with anything. I had a client in the bow of a 16-foot drift boat, a set of oars in my hands, and about 3 seconds to decide whether what I was seeing was real before the current made the decision for me. My name is not important. What is important is that I have guided the Kenai River in Alaska for going on 11 years, and in that time I have seen brown bears swim that river, I have seen moose walk its gravel bars at first light, and I have seen weather roll in off Cook Inlet so fast it turned a calm September afternoon into something that felt actively hostile. I am not a person who startles easily. I am not a person who invents things. What happened on the lower Kenai in early September of 2019 is the reason I no longer guide float trips past mile marker 31. The trip started the way most late season floats start. Gray sky, air temperature somewhere in the low 40s. The river running a little higher than I'd have liked after 2 days of rain upstream. My client that morning was a man named Garrett, a software engineer from outside Seattle who had booked a full-day float through the outfitter I was contracted with at the time. Garrett was in his mid-30s, fit, reasonably experienced on the water, and exactly the kind of client guides prefer: paid attention, followed instructions, didn't talk more than necessary. We put in at the Skilak Lake Road access point just after 7 in the morning. I had the boat loaded the way I always load it, dry bags port side, tackle organized by the cooler, bear spray clipped to the starboard gunnel where I could reach it without thinking. I was wearing my gear the way I always wear it, rubber bibs over a wool base layer, and over everything, my rain jacket. It's an old Helly Hansen, faded red, with a strip of reflective tape on the left shoulder that I put there myself after a near miss with a jet boat one low visibility morning. I have worn that jacket on the Kenai more times than I can count. Garrett knew it was mine. He'd watched me zip it up at the put-in. The first 2 hours were normal. We worked the upper stretch of the lower river, which runs mostly open through a wide glacial valley before it starts to cut into the spruce timber. Garrett caught and released 2 sockeye that were stale and dark from the late run, and we had coffee from a thermos somewhere around mile marker 26. The river was doing what the Kenai does in September, moving fast, cold, opaque green from the glacial flour still suspended in the water column. It smelled like silt and fish and distant rain. The mountains to the north were wearing their first hard frost at the upper elevations, and the air along the water was cold enough that our breath showed when we talked. There is a quality to the Kenai in early September that I have always found difficult to describe to people who haven't been there. The sockeye run is dying out. The fish that haven't spawned yet are dark and stressed and pushing hard upstream, and the ones that have spawned are dying along the banks, their carcasses pulled up into the alders by bears and eagles that have been feeding the same way in the same places for longer than anyone has kept records. The smell of it is everywhere, a deep organic rot that isn't unpleasant so much as it is overwhelming, a reminder that something large and cyclical is happening and that you are incidental to it. I have always felt small on the lower river in September. That year, for the first time, I felt watched. The first thing I noticed that didn't belong was around mile marker 28. There's a section of bank there, river left, where the spruce come down close to the water and the ground stays boggy even in dry years. It's the kind of bank that holds prints well bear, moose, the occasional wolf track. As we drifted past, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Nothing dramatic, just a shape between the trees, roughly upright, that disappeared before I could fix my eyes on it. I turned my head, and there was nothing there. I logged it the way guides log things that might mean something. Filed it, kept moving, stayed watchful. I didn't say anything to Garrett. There was nothing to say yet. At mile marker 29, I heard something that made me set the oars and let the boat drift. It was a voice coming from the river left bank, maybe 40 yards off. A male voice calling out across the water. The words were indistinct at first, just the cadence of someone calling, the shape of syllables without the content, and I remember thinking it was another guide, maybe from a competing outfit, having some kind of equipment problem on the bank. Then it called my name, not a generic shout. My actual name, the full version, the one that appears on my guide certification and on the outfitter's booking sheets, called out in a tone that was almost right, almost like someone who knew me. But there was a half beat of delay in it, the way a recording sounds when the audio and the motion aren't quite synced, and the pitch was a fraction too flat, like someone had heard my voice once and was working from memory. I told Garrett to stay low, and I rowed us toward the center of the channel, away from the left bank. He asked me what was going on. I told him I thought someone might need help. That was a lie. I didn't think anyone needed help. What I thought, though I did not say it out loud, was that something on that bank had just said my name, using a voice that was supposed to be mine, but wasn't quite. We kept moving. The voice didn't call again. For the next 10 minutes I watched the left bank. The spruce were thick enough that the shadows blended together, and the overcast light wasn't doing me any favors. I saw nothing, heard nothing. The river ran, the boat drifted, and Garrett went back to watching his indicator. Then we came around the long bend, above mile marker 30, and I saw it. The right bank on that stretch is open a long gravel bar that extends maybe 150 feet from the water's edge to where the alders start. Good visibility. No cover for most of its length, and standing at the edge of the alders, just at the point where the shadow started, was a figure. Tall, roughly the proportions of a large man, standing completely still, wearing a faded red rain jacket with a strip of reflective tape on the left shoulder. I looked down at my own jacket, zipped to the chin, right where it had been all morning. I have run that gravel bar hundreds of times. I knew exactly how wide the river was. At that point, maybe 80 feet of fast water between us and the bar. No crossing point within a mile in either direction. Whatever was standing on that gravel bar had not waded across. The water was chest deep and moving at better than 6 knots. Nothing was wading through that. Garrett saw it too. I know because he stopped watching his indicator and went very still in the bow. When he spoke, he kept his voice low and level the way people do when they are working hard to sound calm. He said, "That guy is wearing the same jacket as you." I said, "I know." He said, "Did someone take a jacket from your truck?" I said, "My truck is at the takeout, 15 miles downriver." Neither of us said anything after that. The figure on the bank didn't move while we were in view of it. It didn't wave, didn't call out. Just stood there at the alder line, arms hanging, facing the water, facing us. The reflective tape on the shoulder caught the flat gray light and threw it back. I kept my eyes on it until the next bend took it out of sight. I rowed to the center of the channel and held us there, checking my depth with an oar. The water was deep and fast and very cold. I made a note of that without quite understanding yet why it seemed important. At mile marker 30, the voice came back. This time it was on the right bank, which meant it had moved, or another one had moved, across the gravel bar and was now somewhere in the alder thicket at the bar's upper end. The voice was calling again, and this time the words were cleaner. This time I could make them out. It was saying things a version of me might say to a client, instructional things, guidance things. The language was right, but the sequence was wrong, like someone had collected individual sentences and was playing them back in an order that didn't quite make sense. And underneath the words, barely audible, there was a sound I can only describe as breathing that was too rhythmic, too controlled, like something that was regulating the sound of its own breath rather than simply breathing. Garrett turned around to look at me. His face was pale under the hood of his wading jacket. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I told him to stay low. I pulled hard on the oars and moved us to the center of the channel and held us there. I told him to keep his eyes on the right bank and tell me if anything stepped out onto the gravel. He said, "What is that?" I said, "I don't know." That was the honest answer. He said, "Is it a person?" I said, "I don't think so." That was also the honest answer. For the next quarter mile, the thing, whatever it was, paced us. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it, moving through the alder and willow scrub at the bar's edge, keeping pace with the current. Every few minutes the voice would come again, a little closer each time, and each time the words were more coherent, more calibrated, getting better at sounding like something I would actually say. Learning. That was the word that kept surfacing in my mind. It was learning. I rowed faster than I should have. I opened up the throttle, so to speak, digging the oars deep and pulling clean strokes, and I felt the boat accelerate in the current. Garrett braced himself against the bow brace and didn't complain. The voice kept up for another 2 bends, and then it didn't. The silence was not reassuring. The silence felt like a change in tactics. Then, at mile marker 31, the thing stepped out onto the gravel bar on the left bank. It was closer now, maybe 60 feet of water between us. Close enough that I could see the jacket in detail, the fading on the chest, the seam tape at the shoulders, and close enough to see that the proportions of the figure underneath it weren't quite right. The arms were slightly too long. The neck was too forward, too far out from the shoulders, the way an animal's head extends when it's tracking something. And the legs, I cannot fully explain this, but the legs bent in a way that suggested a joint that wasn't a knee. Not dramatically, just enough. Just enough that my brain kept trying to correct the image and couldn't. It was standing in the water. Not deep ankle deep, maybe calf deep, but standing in the current. And it was watching us. What I noticed, now that it was close enough to study, was the way the jacket hung on it. My jacket fits me a certain way, snug across the shoulders, loose through the chest because I bought a size up for layering. On this thing, it was wrong in the opposite direction. Tight through some angles, loose through others, as if the body underneath didn't hold the same geometry as a person. When the wind off the water moved the fabric, the way it moved suggested something other than shoulders beneath it. I am trying to be precise here. I am not trying to be dramatic. The jacket was wrong in the same way a coat draped over a chair is wrong, technically covering something, but the something is not what the coat was made for, and it was still using my voice. Quietly, now. Not calling out, but murmuring, almost to itself, right at the lower edge of audible phrases from that morning. Things I had said to Garrett about reading the current, about strike detection, about how to mend line in fast water, all accurate, all in order. But, running together now in a continuous loop that had no pause for breath, I made a decision. I stopped rowing and held the boat broadside to the current, oars out, and I watched it back. I wanted to see if it would come further in. I wanted to know what the water meant to it. It didn't come further in. It stood at the edge, in the shallows, and it looked at us, or it did whatever it did that corresponded to looking, and it did not advance. The current moved around its legs, and the water level didn't change the way it would around a leg with real mass displacing it. I noticed that. I am a person who spends a lot of time watching water interact with things. That interaction was wrong. The water was the line. I understood that then. I held my ground for about 30 seconds, which felt considerably longer, and then I turned the boat downstream and I rowed. I rode hard and clean and without stopping for the next 4 miles until the Kenai Highway Bridge came into view and I could hear traffic and see the lights of the takeout parking area on the right bank. We came off the water at 12 minutes past 1 in the afternoon, and I had Garrett out of the boat and up the bank before the bow had stopped moving. He didn't argue. He understood. I filed a report that afternoon with the Alaska Department of Fish and Wildlife. The ranger I spoke with was a woman named Officer Halverson, stationed out of the Soldotna office, and to her credit she did not dismiss what I told her. She took notes on a yellow legal pad while I talked, and she asked me several precise measured questions. How long did the figure remain stationary? Did it appear to be tracking the boat or fixed to a position? Did it make physical contact with the water, or was it standing at the margin? The questions told me she had asked similar questions before. She told me there had been 2 other reports from that same stretch of the lower Kenai in the preceding 6 weeks, both involving guides, both involving a figure that moved along the banks, both involving voice anomalies. She asked me not to publicize the reports while they continued their assessment. She did not tell me what she thought it was. The incident was logged under case number Ken 2019-09-14. I was told the reports were forwarded to the Alaska Department of Public Safety for review. I never heard anything back about their conclusions. The following spring, when I asked Officer Halverson about the case at the Kenai Visitor Center during the preseason guide orientation, she looked at me for a moment and then said, very carefully, that the file had been closed as inconclusive and transferred to a different department. She didn't say which one. I didn't ask. Garrett sent me a text 2 days later. It said, I looked up everything I could find about what could mimic voices on the Kenai. Didn't find anything satisfying. Don't know if that makes it better or worse. I didn't reply. I didn't have anything useful to say. I guide the upper river now, above the canyon. Open water, wide visibility, no long sections of heavy timber pressing close on both banks. I have not floated below mile marker 28 since September of 2019, and I do not plan to. My clients sometimes ask why my float trips don't cover the lower section anymore. I tell them the upper water is better fishing this time of year. That's sometimes true. It's never the real reason. 11 years on that river. This is the one rule I've added that isn't in any guide manual. If you're on a river in heavy country and you hear a voice from the bank that sounds almost like someone you know, don't move toward it. Don't answer it. Stay in the channel, keep moving, and hold the water between you and the bank at all costs. Whatever uses that voice, it seems to understand the river is not its ground. It will test the margin. It will stand in the shallows and watch you pass, but it will not follow you in. The river is your boundary. Trust it. Use it. Don't give it up. Story 2, The Voice in the Empty Tent. The voice came from inside the tent. My partner was standing outside it with me. That's the part I keep coming back to whenever I try to explain what happened on the southeast fork of the Kahiltna Glacier in August of 2017. Not the days before it, not what we found afterward, just that single moment, both of us on the same side of the nylon wall looking at each other, listening to the sound of one of us talking from somewhere we weren't. I'll start from the beginning because it matters. My name is Aaron. I was 29 years old that summer, working a volunteer contract with the Denali Mountaineering Rangers as a backcountry cache assistant. The job was exactly what it sounds like. You go up onto the mountain, you check the equipment caches that support ranger operations on the upper mountain, you log their condition, resupply what you can carry, and you come back down. It is a physical job, unglamorous, and the pay is nothing because it's volunteer. I did it because I wanted mountain time and the resume credit, and because my college roommate, a man named Garrett, no relation to anyone in any story you've heard before, had done it the previous summer and said it was the best 2 weeks of his life. Garrett came back with me that summer. 2 volunteers, 1 assignment, 11 days on the lower mountain. We had done enough backcountry work together by that point that we didn't need to talk through systems. We just moved, divided tasks, checked each other's gear without being asked. That kind of partnership matters in a technical environment. You want to be with someone whose habits you already know, because in an emergency you don't have time to learn them. We flew in by bush plane to the base camp on the southeast Kahiltna, which sits at roughly 7,000 feet of elevation and is the staging point for most of the standard Denali routes. Base camp in August is a quiet place. The main climbing season peaks in May and June, and by August the glacier has mostly cleared out, a few late season teams still pushing for the summit, the occasional guided group moving through, but nothing like the spring crowds. The ranger station at base camp is staffed through September, and the two rangers on rotation that August were a man named Officer Whitfield and his partner, whose call sign in the radio logs was Ranger 2. Whitfield briefed us on our assignment the morning after we arrived. 2 cache sites needed checking, one at 10,500 feet on the West Buttress route and one at 9,200 feet on the Southeast Fork approach. We do the lower one first, spend a night at a designated camp near the cache, then drop back to base camp the following afternoon. Weather was forecast good for 4 days. We had a full kit: VHF radios, beacon, paper maps, a bare canister of food, a 2-person mountaineering tent, and all the appropriate gear for an Alaskan glacier environment in August. Which is to say, it was still very cold, and the sun was strong enough to burn you even through cloud cover. He also gave us the standard orientation for that section of the glacier, crevasse zones to avoid, the specific flags marking the safe route, the location of the nearest emergency cache, and the protocol for calling in any wildlife encounters. The word wildlife in that briefing was doing a lot of work. The Alaska Range is brown bear country at the lower elevations, and there had been documented encounters with bears on the glacier itself. Bears have been found on the Kahiltna at altitudes that have no business supporting them, traveling routes that don't make sense from a food perspective. Whitfield mentioned this the way guides mention things they've stopped trying to explain, matter-of-fact, filed, moved past quickly. He did not mention anything else that might be out there. I don't know now whether that was because he didn't know or because he had decided it wasn't useful to say. The approach to the Southeast Fork cache took most of the first day. The Kahiltna Glacier travel is roped travel. The glacier is crevassed throughout, and moving unroped on it is how guides describe other people's mistakes to their clients. Garrett and I had roped up since before we left base camp, and we moved in a system, probing ahead where the snow was suspicious, taking the established route where the flags were still standing. The glacier groaned occasionally beneath us, the way glaciers do, deep structural sounds that have nothing to do with surface conditions, the mountain adjusting its own weight against itself. I have never found that sound comforting. We found the cache in good condition, logged it, photographed it, replaced 3 items that had been compromised by the previous winter's snowpack, and radioed our status to base camp at 4 in the afternoon. Whitfield copied our report and told us to make camp and check in again at 8 the next morning. While we were working the cache, I heard something that I didn't mention to Garrett at the time. It came from above us, from the ice field that rises toward the West Buttress route, a sound that was either wind channeling through a crevasse or something vocalizing at a distance. I couldn't pin it down. It had the quality of a voice without the content of one, the shape of speech without any words I could identify. It lasted maybe 4 seconds, and then the wind shifted and it was gone. I filed it under glacier acoustics and kept working. Glaciers are strange acoustic environments. Sound bounces off ice faces and travels in ways that don't make sense from the source direction. I had explanations available, and I used them. We set up the tent on a flat platform of compacted snow about 30 meters from the cache site. It was the standard 2-person mountaineering shelter, a double-wall design, freestanding, with a vestibule large enough to store our packs. We cooked in the vestibule, ate inside, and had everything organized the way you organize things when you know you might need to move quickly in bad weather. Boots inside, headlamps clipped to the tent body, radios charging off a battery bank. We had agreed before leaving base camp that one of us would keep the radio on through the night, low volume, just enough to hear if base called. It was a precaution Whitfield had suggested without explaining why he was suggesting it. We followed it without asking. By 9 that night, the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees, and the sky had gone a deep, flat purple. We were both tired from the day's approach. I was in my sleeping bag working on my field log when Garrett said he was going outside to check the tent stakes. The snow on the upper glacier gets wind consolidated and hard, and stakes can work loose if the anchor pattern isn't right. I told him I'd do it with him. He said it would take 5 minutes and for me to stay warm. He unzipped the tent door and stepped out into the vestibule, and then out onto the snow. I kept writing in my field log. 30 seconds later, Garrett said something from outside. I couldn't make out the words. The wind was moving across the tent fabric and breaking up the sound, so I called out and asked him to say it again. And from inside the tent, directly behind me, pressed up against the far wall of the tent body from the inside, a voice said, "Found one loose, checking the others." It was Garrett's voice. His exact cadence, the specific flatness he carries in his vowels when he's concentrating on something practical. I heard it from inside the tent, 6 inches of nylon wall behind me. Inside the same space I was sitting in, I turned around. The tent was empty. I did not move for what was probably 3 seconds, but felt much longer. Then I unzipped the tent door, stepped into the vestibule, pushed through the outer door, and stepped onto the glacier. Garrett was crouched at the uphill corner of the tent, tamping down a stake with the heel of his boot. He looked up when I came out. He said, "You didn't have to come out." I said, "Did you just say something?" He said, "Yeah, through the tent." Said, "I found one loose." I said, "That's not where the voice came from." He stopped what he was doing and looked at me. The next part is harder to tell in a way that doesn't sound like we panicked, because we didn't. We were trained people in a technical environment, and we both understood that panic is how you get killed on a glacier. What we did was stand next to each other on the snow in the 15-degree air and talk through what had just happened in very low voices, the way people talk when they're trying to be precise. Garrett said the words once, quietly, through the tent fabric from outside the uphill corner. He had leaned toward the tent as he said it, which should have projected the sound through the nylon from that direction, from behind the tent, above me, not from behind me at the far wall. The voice I heard had come from inside the tent, from the far interior wall, from somewhere no one was. We checked the tent, we checked the vestibule. We walked a perimeter around the campsite in opposite directions, meeting at the downhill side. The glacier around us was empty. No tracks in the wind-consolidated snow beyond our own established trail. Nothing had approached the site. Nothing had been at the tent while we were standing outside it. We got back inside and we zipped everything shut, and we did not talk about it for about an hour. Then Garrett said, very quietly, "It knew exactly what I'd said." I said I knew. He said, "Not close. Exact. Word for word, and the same timing." I said, "I know." Because that was the thing. It wasn't an approximation. It wasn't a close mimicry. Whatever had produced that voice from inside the tent had reproduced Garrett's statement with a precision that suggested it had heard him, processed it, and played it back without any modification. The way a recording would, except it was warm and directional, and it had presence, the sense that it was coming from a specific location in three-dimensional space rather than from a speaker. The temperature outside dropped further that night. By midnight, the wind had picked up and the tent fabric was working in the gusts. We kept the radios on the Ranger frequency, and neither of us slept much. The sounds of the glacier at night are their own thing, deep settling sounds, the occasional creak of ice under stress, the wind across the snowfield producing a low tonal note that changes pitch as the gusts vary. I had slept on glaciers before, and I knew what those sounds were. I cataloged them as they came and held on to the ones I recognized. The ones I didn't recognize I held on to more carefully. Sometime around 1 in the morning, I heard something walking on the snow near the tent. I say walking because that's the closest word for it, though the cadence was wrong, slightly too slow between steps, with a pause between each footfall that suggested deliberate placement rather than natural movement, like something that had learned to walk recently and was still working out the weight distribution. It made 2 passes around the uphill side of the tent and then stopped. I did not wake Garrett. I lay still and listened. The footsteps did not resume. The wind kept working and the glacier kept settling, and nothing else came for about 45 minutes. Then Garrett put his hand on my arm. I had been awake, staring at the tent ceiling, and he had been awake too. He pointed at the far wall of the tent. I looked. The tent wall was moving. Not from the wind, the movement was from the outside, deliberate, like something running a hand along the exterior fabric, slow, testing, moving from the lower corner upward along the seam line. Then it stopped. Then Garrett's voice came from outside the tent, from right against the tent wall, saying my name. Just my name, twice, in that flat, practical tone, as if checking whether I was awake. Garrett was inside the tent next to me. His hand was still on my arm. He had not spoken. I picked up the VHF and keyed it and said very clearly that we had a situation at our camp position and requested radio confirmation with base. Whitfield came back within 2 minutes. I told him what was happening. He told us to activate our beacons, stay inside the tent, and do not unzip for anyone who did not give the correct daily call sign, which he then provided. He said he was logging the contact and would have someone on standby at base. The thing outside the tent made sounds for another 40 minutes. It moved around the perimeter twice. It said Garrett's name. It said my name. It said, once, in a voice that was neither of ours, something flatter and more resonant, like a voice slowed down to the edge of recognition, a question about whether we were cold. Just those words, delivered without emotion, the way someone reads a sentence aloud to check its grammar before they commit to it. Then it stopped and didn't come back. We lay still for another 20 minutes after the last sound. Neither of us spoke. The radio hummed its quiet static, and the glacier kept doing what glaciers do, and the wind dropped sometime around 4 in the morning, and the silence that replaced it was the loudest thing I have heard in my life. Complete, total absence of sound at 9,000 feet on a glacier in Alaska, and somewhere in that silence both of us were listening with everything we had for the sound of footsteps that did not come back. We broke camp at first light and moved downhill to base camp without stopping. The approach we'd taken 12 hours to make and the ascent we covered in 4 hours going down, moving as fast as we responsibly could on a roped glacier travel system. Whitfield met us at base camp. He looked at our faces and didn't ask unnecessary questions. He sat us down in the ranger station with hot coffee, and he took our statements individually, which I found notable. He separated us deliberately, the way investigators separate witnesses before they've compared notes, to get the accounts uncontaminated. Our statements matched. He told us they would. He said it in a way that meant he had done this before. He filed a report that afternoon documenting the radio contact and our account. The incident was logged under reference number DNL1708-AK7, flagged as an unresolved wildlife incident pending follow-up review. He told us the review would take several months and that we might be contacted by the Alaska Department of Public Safety for a follow-up interview. We were not contacted. I called the ranger station the following February and was told the file had been transferred to a regional office for review. The person I spoke with was polite and specific and gave me no useful information. I was told later, informally, by Ranger 2 Whitfield's partner, who I spoke to briefly on the flight back to Talkeetna, that there had been 2 prior incidents logged from that same fork, involving what the reports described as anomalous vocalizations near established camp positions. She said both prior reports had come from experienced parties. She said the review board had not reached a conclusion. She paused for a moment and then said that personally, she had started scheduling her own rotation assignments to avoid that fork after dark. She said it in the careful way people say things they know aren't going to be resolved. Garrett still goes back to the Alaska range every summer. I don't. I still do technical terrain. I've guided rock and ice routes in the Cascades since that year, but I haven't returned to glacier travel in the Denali corridor. I'm not sure exactly where the line is between caution and avoidance. I haven't spent a lot of time trying to locate it. What I know is this. Whatever was outside that tent was patient. It didn't rush. It didn't escalate dramatically. It worked the edges of the situation the way something does when it is accustomed to having time on its side, testing the wall, learning the voices, mapping the threshold. That patience is the part that stays with me. Not the voice from inside the empty tent, not the sound of it walking, not the question about whether we were cold. The patience, the sense that it had done this before and knew how long it took and was in no particular hurry. If you're in a tent in remote country and you hear a voice from inside that isn't coming from whoever's in there with you, don't respond. Don't call out asking who's there. Don't unzip the door to check. The sound is not lost. The sound is not the wind. Something outside is working on learning the difference between you and itself, and the only thing it seems uncertain about is the threshold. Don't help it resolve that uncertainty. Stay inside. Keep the wall between you. Wait for real light. Move at dawn. Story 3. The Parks Highway redirect at 2:41 a.m. Every radio in the maintenance yard went silent at the same time. Not static. Not interference. Just silence, the kind that has weight to it, the kind you notice the same way you notice a room go cold. 4 radios on 4 different channels, and they all went quiet together, like something had reached into the frequencies and closed a fist around them. I've been running winter maintenance on the Parks Highway north of Cantwell for going on 9 years. I know what radio interference sounds like up here. I know what a repeater malfunction sounds like. What happened on the night of January 14th was neither of those things. I know the difference. That's what I keep telling people, and that's what I'm going to tell you now. The Parks Highway runs roughly 230 miles between Wasilla and Fairbanks, cutting through the Alaska Range at Broad Pass and dropping down the north side through heavy spruce and willow scrub into the interior. In winter, it is one of the more unforgiving roads in the state, not because it's particularly narrow or technically difficult, but because the weather can change from manageable to lethal in under an hour, and because the distances between services mean that a disabled vehicle in the wrong conditions is a survival problem, not an inconvenience. I have pulled 3 people out of ditches on that highway in 9 winters who would have been dead by morning if they'd sat and waited for someone to find them without calling it in. That road does not forgive mistakes, and it does not reward hesitation. Our crew that January was 4 people. I was the shift supervisor. My 2 plow operators were a man named Russell, who had worked the parks for 6 years and knew every drift pattern on his section like he'd memorized the road personally, and a younger guy named Kobe, who was in his second full winter and still learning to read the way wind loads a shoulder differently than it loads an open travel lane. Our 4th crew member was a dispatcher named Patricia, who worked the radio in the maintenance yard from a heated building near the highway junction at the south end of our district. Patricia had been at that desk for 12 years. She knew the sound of every one of our trucks on the radio, knew our voices, knew our habits. That matters later. We started the shift at 10 p.m. The temperature was negative 27 and dropping. Wind from the northwest at 15 to 20 knots, gusting to 30 in the open stretches near Broad Pass. Road surface was packed snow with scattered ice, and there was active blowing snow reducing visibility to under a quarter mile in exposed sections. A normal bad night on the parks, in other words. The kind of night where you keep your trucks moving and your radio traffic tight because everyone has to know where everyone else is. Loose radio discipline on a night like that is how a supervisor ends up making a notification call to someone's family. By midnight, we had the main travel lanes in passable condition from mile marker 2 to 10 to mile marker 226. Russell was working his section north of the pass, which is the most exposed, stretch wide open plateau country, where the wind builds uninterrupted across the flats and can stack a drift across the road in under 20 minutes. Kobe was running the southern section down through the canyon approach, which is technically trickier, tight curves, variable grade, sections where the roadbed sits above the drainage and ice forms faster than anywhere else. I was doing supervisor passes between them, checking their work, monitoring road temps with a handheld IR thermometer at spot intervals, coordinating with the DOT district office in Palmer via Patricia. The first hour was clean, radio check-ins on schedule, both trucks reporting normal conditions, Patricia running smooth at the yard, nothing that would make you think about anything other than the road. That changed just before 1 in the morning, when Russell called in to report something on the shoulder of mile marker 221. Not a vehicle, something that had crossed the road and left a track he'd caught in his work lights. He described it as a large track, wider than a moose print, with a stride length that didn't match any animal he knew from that area. He'd slowed down and looked at it for a few seconds and then kept moving, because you don't stop a loaded plow truck in a drift zone to look at tracks. He mentioned it as a footnote to his position report, the way experienced people mention things they're not ready to categorize yet. I told him to log it and keep his section. I noted the mile marker and the time. I didn't say much else about it on open radio. That was the first thing. The track. I tell you about it because it matters to understand what came after. There was something moving parallel to the highway that night, something that had crossed the road at mile marker 221 heading east. We didn't know yet that it was going to get closer. At 1:30 in the morning, something changed. It started with the voice traffic. We were running standard radio protocol check-ins every 30 minutes, position reports when changing sections, quick advisories when we encountered anything notable, organized, efficient, the way a good night crew runs. And somewhere around 1:30, the check-in calls started coming in slightly wrong. I don't mean garbled or broken up. I mean the cadence was off. Russell's check-ins come in a specific rhythm, position, road condition, any notes, clear. Very fast, very clipped, same order every time, same tone. The call that came through at 1:32 was Russell's voice and Russell's content, but the sequence was off. Road condition came first, then position. Small thing. I almost didn't notice. I radioed Russell directly and asked for a position confirmation. He came back immediately, real Russell, right cadence, right order, and told me he was at mile marker 222 heading north. He hadn't made a check-in call. He had been running his section with his plow down and hadn't keyed up for about 10 minutes. I asked him to say that again. He said he had not called in at 1:32. He had been running with his radio on his hip, volume low, working a drift that was building on the shoulder. Somebody had used Russell's voice and Russell's frequency to call in a fake position report. I told him to confirm his actual position on my mark, which he did. I told Patricia to log the discrepancy and flag it. She did. I didn't say anything else about it over open radio because I didn't know what was listening. At 2:09, Kobe called me directly, not on the main channel but on the secondary channel we use for supervisor-only traffic. His voice was tight in the way young guys get when they're working hard to sound calmer than they are. He said he'd had a close call in his section near mile marker 213. He said something had been standing in the road. Not a moose. He knew what a moose looked like in headlights, and this was not that. It was upright, roughly person-shaped, standing in the southbound lane approximately 150 feet ahead of him when he crested a small rise. He'd gotten on his brakes hard, which on packed snow at the speed he was running was its own problem, and by the time the truck stopped, the thing was gone. Not moved to the shoulder. Gone. He said it had been wearing what looked like a DOT high-visibility jacket. I asked him to describe it more carefully. He took a moment and then said the thing that stayed with me. He said it had been facing him head-on, but the shoulders were angled wrong, like the body was pointed one direction and the head was pointed another. He said it reminded him of the way a bird turns its head to look at something with one eye directly, that sideways orientation, except this was a figure that was otherwise human-shaped, and the wrongness of it was in how the pieces related to each other rather than in any single feature. He said it held that position for the full 2 seconds before his headlights fully illuminated it, and then it was simply not there. I told him to hold his position, and I drove to his location. The road surface was pristine snow in that section, barely touched by his plow pass. If something had been standing there, it would have left a depression, a print, something. There was nothing in the southbound lane. There were no tracks on either shoulder. Whatever had been there had not walked to or from the position through the snow. I stood in the road at -27 and looked at a perfectly unbroken snow surface, and I felt something I don't usually feel on a highway job, which is the specific chill that has nothing to do with the air temperature. Kobe and I drove back to the maintenance yard together at 2:30, moving in convoy. That was when the radios went silent. All four of them. Mine in the truck, the spare unit on the seat, Kobe's unit, and we found out moments later Patricia's base radio in the dispatch building, 2:41 a.m. All four, simultaneously. We pulled into the yard, and I went straight into the building. Patricia was already on the landline to the district office in Palmer, reporting the outage. She looked up when I came in and pointed at the window on the north side of the building. I looked out. There was a figure standing at the edge of the yard where the security lighting gave way to the dark, at the exact threshold where the lights stopped, standing completely still, facing the building. Wearing a high visibility jacket that caught the light the way dock gear does, orange and yellow, reflective tape, the full thing. Wearing it the way someone wears something they've seen but not put on before. Too loose in some places. Collar up at an angle that wasn't wind. The arms hung too long below the jacket cuffs. And the head was tilted at about 15 degrees. A slow tilt, like something listening. Not looking, listening. We had floodlights on the yard. They covered the equipment bays and the fuel station and about 50 feet of the approach road. The figure was standing at the precise edge of that illuminated area. Not in the dark, not in the light, at the line. And it wasn't moving. Patricia said she'd been watching it for about 4 minutes. She said it had walked up the access road to the yard, which was a plowed gravel road with firm enough base that it might not leave clear tracks, and stopped at the light line and stood there. She said it had not crossed. She said it had not moved at all since it stopped. She said it had been making calls on the radio frequency before the radios went out. She'd heard her own name come through in a voice she didn't recognize. Trying to be a voice, she did something that had the shape of one of our crew voices, but not the texture of it, flat and too precise, the way text-to-speech used to sound before it got good. I watched it for about 90 seconds while Patricia stayed on the landline. During that 90 seconds, it remained perfectly still, except for one moment when the yard lights flickered, a power line issue, common at those temperatures, and in the half second of lowered light, it moved. Not much. Shifted its weight from one foot to the other. But the movement was wrong. The weight transfer happened from the top down, the shoulders moving first, before the hips, which is not how people shift their weight when they're standing still. It was a learned behavior, not an instinctive one. When the light stabilized, it was still again. I picked up the landline and got the district duty officer on the phone and told him we had a situation at the Cantwell maintenance yard and I needed a state trooper unit if one was available and I needed it soon. The duty officer asked what kind of situation. I told him there was an unidentified individual on yard property who had been intercepting our radio communications, and I believe they were responsible for what Kobe had encountered on the highway. I did not tell him everything I was seeing. I kept it to the facts that a duty officer could process. The duty officer said he would contact the Alaska State Troopers dispatch in Fairbanks. By the time I finished the call, the figure at the light line was gone. I don't know exactly when it left. I had been facing away from the window for less than 3 minutes. When I looked back, the threshold was empty. Patricia said it had not walked away. She said it had simply not been there the next time she looked. We kept all four of us inside the building until a trooper unit arrived at 4:15. The trooper, a sergeant named Halverson, out of the Cantwell post, walked the yard perimeter with a flashlight. On the access road, in a section where the gravel had a thin skim of refrozen ice, he found a partial track, not a boot print. The shape was wrong for a boot. It was wider at the heel, narrower across what should have been the ball of the foot, and the toe impression was elongated in a way that suggested something longer than a human foot trying to approximate the distribution of one. He photographed it. He did not comment on it in my presence. He filed a report under incident number AST CAN 1401-19. I have a copy. Under nature of incident, it reads, unauthorized access, communications interference, unidentified individual. Under resolution, it reads, subject not located. Under follow-up required, it reads, yes, forwarded to Wildlife Division and Department of Public Safety Special Investigations. I called the Special Investigations Office 6 weeks later. I was told the file was under review and they couldn't discuss active cases. Russell still runs that section of the parks. He's senior crew now, and he requested to stay on that district specifically, which I respect. Kobe transferred to a road crew in the Matsu Valley the following spring, his choice made quietly, without a lot of explanation. Patricia retired from DOT dispatch at the end of that fiscal year, which she had been planning before any of this happened, though she told me when she packed up her desk that she hadn't been sorry to have a reason to feel okay about leaving. I'm still on nights. I still run the parks in winter because somebody has to, and I'm the one who knows it. I know mile marker 213 better now than I knew it then, and I know what the road surface looks like when nothing has crossed it, and I know the difference. The troopers never closed the case. The file with the Special Investigations Office is still listed as under review, which in my experience means it went somewhere that doesn't talk to the outside. I stopped calling about it after the third time I was told there was no update available. Sergeant Halverson transferred to the Fairbanks post 8 months later. I don't know if the two things are related. I don't know a lot of things about that night that I'd like to know. What I think about some nights when I'm running that highway and the radio's quiet and the snow is moving sideways across the headlights is this. Whatever was out there, that January had a plan. The fake position report was designed to move me. The figure in the road was designed to stop Kobe. If I had responded to that first radio call by going to the position it reported 222, Russell section, a stretch of highway with no other traffic and no line of sight to the yard, I would have been exactly where it wanted me. Alone, out of the truck, on the road surface, at negative 27, in the dark. It was patient. It had a sequence. The only thing that broke the sequence was that I noticed a wrong cadence in a radio call, and that I kept moving instead of stopping. 9 winters on that highway and 1 January changed the way I run every shift since. Whatever is out there in that corridor understands radio traffic. It listens, learns the voices, and uses them to move people into position. If you're on a remote highway and a check-in call comes through, that sounds almost like your crew, but the sequence is wrong, the timing is off, or the voice is just a fraction too clean. Don't respond to it. Don't follow any redirect it gives you. Raise your actual crew on a secondary channel. Confirm their position directly and keep moving. Stay in the vehicle. And if something is standing at the exact edge of your light, at that precise boundary where your headlights stop, do not get out to investigate. It has already spent hours learning your voice, your route, your schedule. The only advantage you hold is the light and the speed and the fact that you're inside it. The light is the boundary. Stay inside it. Story 4, what came back from the Ridgie. My brother made it out. The man who walked into camp wearing his face did not. I need you to understand something before I tell you the rest of the story. My brother Lyle and I have hunted together for 22 years. I know how he walks. I know how he sounds when he's cold and tired. I know the specific way he holds his rifle when he's packing it across broken terrain barrel down, right hand loose on the grip, left hand tucked under the sling near the swivel. I know these things the way you know the things you have watched 1,000 times. I am telling you this because when I say that the thing that walked into camp that evening in September of 2021 was not my brother, I need you to understand that I am not speaking from fear or confusion. I am speaking from 22 years of knowing exactly what my brother looks like and the clear, cold recognition that what came down off that ridge was wearing him like a suit it had found in the dark. We were 11 days into a moose hunt in the Wrangell St. Elias National Preserve, working a drainage in the Nutsoten Mountains north of the Nebezna Road. This was a horseback hunt out of a spike camp. We'd packed in ourselves 4 horses, 2 riders, a wall tent, a wood stove, and enough food for 2 weeks. The Nutsatin country is some of the most remote terrain in North America that you can reasonably access without an aircraft. The Nebesna Road is 60 miles of gravel that ends at a small mining settlement, and from the end of that road you're looking at a half-day pack into country that sees maybe a handful of hunting parties per year. Cell service ends about 20 miles before the road does. The satellite communicator we'd brought was our only link to anything outside that drainage, and we checked it once a day whether we needed to or not, the way you do when you understand what it would mean to need it and not have it working. The country up there is open tundra on the high ground with willow and alder thickets in the drainages, and it holds moose well in September when the bulls are starting to move with the rut. The tundra at that elevation in early fall is every shade of red and amber, low blueberry and crowberry turned by the first frosts, and the air smells like wet rock and distant snow and the faint sweetness of dying vegetation. It is genuinely beautiful country. I have loved it on every trip I've made up there, and I want to be clear about that because what happened does not change the fact that the country itself is exactly what it's supposed to be. What happened came from something else, something that was using the country the way a trap uses a clearing. We'd glassed a shooter bull on our third day and had been working toward a position on him ever since, reading the terrain and the wind and his patterns. By day 11 we had a reasonable picture of his range and we were close to committing to a stalk. The plan that morning had been to split up briefly Lyle to the upper ridge to glass from elevation, me to work the horses to better grazing and maintain camp, and then reassemble in the late afternoon to finalize the approach for the following day. Clean division of labor. We'd done it that way a dozen times over the years without any issues. On day 11, Lyle decided to glass the upper ridge above our camp while I broke down our midday spot and moved the horses to a better grazing area in the lower drainage. It was a clear separation of tasks, him high, me low, meet back at camp by 5 in the afternoon. We'd done that kind of split dozens of times. He took his rifle, his binoculars, his pack with emergency kit, and the handheld radio we used to coordinate between camp and any elevated glassing position. Before he left, I watched him check the radio battery and clip it to his chest harness. That detail matters. I watched him do it. The radio he was carrying when the thing came into camp was clipped to the chest harness the same way. I watched him start up the ridge at about 1 in the afternoon. He moved the way Lyle moves on tundra, long stride, slightly duck-footed on the downslope edges, always scanning. I watched him until he crested the first bench and dropped out of sight. Then I went to work on the horses. I moved the horses, reset the picket lines, made coffee on the camp stove, and spent the rest of the afternoon doing the slow maintenance work that a spike camp always generates. Around 4:30 I started watching the ridge. At 4:52 my radio crackled. Lyle's voice, reporting that he'd glassed the bull again 2 drainages north, probably a 6-hour pack if we killed him up there. He sounded tired and satisfied the way hunters sound at the end of a long glassing session. I told him to come down and we'd talk through the plan over dinner. He said he was already moving. I started on dinner. At 5:20 I heard boots on the tundra approaching camp from the ridge side. I looked up. The figure coming down was wearing Lyle's gear. His orange vest, his pack, his rifle slung the way Lyle slings it, moving at the right pace for a man who'd been on his feet since 1 in the afternoon, coming from the right direction. But the stride was wrong. Lyle is duck-footed on downslope. I told you that. The figure coming down the ridge was pigeon-toed, each step placed with the toes angled in rather than out, which is the opposite of Lyle's gait, and placed with a deliberateness that wasn't fatigue, it was the deliberateness of something paying attention to where it was putting its feet, because it was still working out the mechanics. I put down the cook pot, and I stood up, and I watched it come. It covered the last 200 yards to camp in about 3 minutes. It came through the perimeter of the wall tent skyline area, and it stopped about 10 feet from me, and it looked at me, and it said, in Lyle's voice, that the bull had moved east. The voice was right. The inflection was right. The exact phrasing, moved east, which is how Lyle says it, because he's economical with words. After a long day was right, but there was no breath vapor. It was 38 degrees and dropping, and at that temperature, in still air, breath condensation is visible on every exhale. My breath was showing clearly in the evening air. The horses behind me were producing steady plumes with every exhale. Whatever was standing in front of me in my brother's gear, speaking in my brother's voice, was producing no condensation whatsoever. Its chest did not move the way a chest moves when a person has been walking at elevation for 4 hours. There was no exertion in it. It stood as still as something that had been standing still all day, not something that had just come down a ridge. I said, "How's your knee?" Lyle had tweaked his left knee on day 4, crossing a boulder field, and had been favoring it consistently since then. Every morning he'd been stretching it for 10 minutes before he put weight on it, and every evening he'd been icing it with a bag of snow from the drainage edge. It was a constant and well-documented feature of our 11th day of hunting. The thing in my brother's gear said his knee was fine. Lyle's knee was not fine. Lyle had been complaining about his knee every single morning and evening since day 4, and the idea that it would simply be fine after an afternoon of ridge work on tundra was not possible. It would have been worse, not better. That was the tell. It had gotten almost everything right: the voice, the gear, the approach angle, the general body type, and it had missed one small specific thing that I only knew because I had been watching Lyle for 11 consecutive days in close quarters. I took one step back. I put my hand on the rifle leaning against the tent pole behind me. I did not raise it. I just put my hand on it and I watched the thing process that movement. Something changed in its posture when I touched the rifle. Not dramatically. A subtle shift. The kind of shift that is easy to miss if you're not watching for it. The way an animal shifts when it understands it has been identified. The head angle changed. The shoulders dropped a fraction. The weight distribution through the hips altered in a way that was no longer trying to replicate Lyle's stance. It was settling into something else. Something underneath the performance that was older than the performance. And the eyes, I am going to tell you about the eyes because I have to and because I have not told anyone else this part. The eyes in my brother's face were the right color and the right shape, but they were tracking wrong. They were not moving the way eyes move when a person is reading a situation and working through responses, the slight saccades, the micro adjustments, the blink rate of a human face processing information. These eyes were still, completely still, fixed on me with an attention that had no movement in it whatsoever, the way eyes are still in a photograph. The face around them was doing everything a face should do. The eyes were doing nothing. I said, "Lyle, go back up the ridge." It said in Lyle's voice that it didn't understand what I meant. I said, "I'm not talking to you." There was a pause, a beat that lasted about 2 seconds, too long for a natural conversation. During that pause, the eyes shifted not to look somewhere else, but the fixed quality of them changed, the way a screen changes when the image refreshes, as if something behind them had made a decision. I raised my voice then and called Lyle's name up the ridge, loud, twice. 30 seconds of silence in which the thing in front of me did not move or react. Then, from up the ridge, 150 yards above camp, faint but absolutely clear, Lyle's actual voice, calling back, asking why I was shouting. The thing in front of me turned its head toward the sound from up the ridge. That movement was wrong too. It turned too far, past the point where a human neck stops. Just a few degrees past. Just enough. Then it turned back to me. And in the moment it was fully facing me again, I saw something in its expression that I have spent 2 years trying to find words for. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was the expression of something that had been very close to completing a task and had been interrupted at the last moment and was now running a calculation about what to do next. I had the rifle up by then. I did not aim at it. I aimed above it. I fired once into the air above the thing's head, a warning shot, and the sound of the rifle in the narrow drainage was very loud, and the echo came back off the ridge walls and folded back on itself, and when it finished, the thing in my brother's gear was gone, not moving away, not running, gone, the way a shape disappears from the edge of your vision when you turn to look at it, directly present in one moment, absent in the next, with no transition between. Lyle came down the ridge at a run, rifle in hand, calling my name. He reached camp out of breath and looked at me, and looked at the empty space where the thing had been standing, and said, "What did you shoot at?" I told him. All of it, standing in the firelight with the horses stamping at their picket lines behind us, while the drainage went dark around the camp perimeter and the ridge line above us faded from amber to gray to black. Lyle listened the way he listens to serious things, completely still, no interruptions, processing. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, long enough that I started to wonder if he believed me. Then he said, "It called me on the radio." I said, "What do you mean?" He said at around 5 o'clock, while he was still on the upper bench working toward the ridge crest, he'd received a radio call in my voice, telling him to hold his position and glass the north drainage for another hour. The reasoning given was that I'd spotted movement from camp and wanted him elevated for longer. It had sounded completely like me, he said. He'd had no hesitation about it at all. He'd complied. He'd spent an extra 40 minutes on the ridge because he'd heard my voice tell him to stay. He'd been up there the whole time, watching a drainage that had nothing in it, while something was down in camp working on what to do when he arrived. We sat with that for a while. Then Lyle said, very quietly, "It used your voice to keep me away from camp. It used my face to try to get into camp." He paused. It needed us separated. That framing hit me hard, because it was right. The thing had run a coordinated operation. It had a radio. It had studied both of us well enough to replicate both of us. It had a plan with a sequence. And if I hadn't noticed the pigeon-toed gate coming down the ridge, if I hadn't known that one specific thing about the way Lyle moves on downslope tundra, the sequence would have completed. I have thought many times since that night about what the completion of that sequence looked like from the thing's perspective. I have not come to any conclusions I find acceptable, so I stopped thinking about it before I get there. We broke camp at first light the next morning, moving in the dark with headlamps, packing the horses by feel and memory. We were on the Nebesna Road by mid-morning and in Talk by early afternoon. We filed a report at the Alaska State Troopers post on the main street. The trooper who took our report, a man named Sergeant Whitmore, listened without interrupting and asked careful, specific questions about the physical details, height, gear configuration, what exactly the gait irregularity looked like, the precise degree of neck rotation. He wrote everything down in a small notebook. At the end, he closed the notebook and told us, without expression, that the preserve rangers had 2 prior incident reports from that drainage involving a figure in a hunter's camp that did not match the description of any member of the hunting party on site. He said it the way people say things that have stopped surprising them. The incident was filed under report number WSE 2109-NT3. It was forwarded to the Preserve's Resource Management Office and to a department Sergeant Whitmore identified only as the Special Liaison Unit. I have not heard back from either. Lyle and I still hunt together every September. We do not go back to that drainage, and we have one standing rule now that we did not have before. If we split up, we agree on a confirmation word before we separate. Something specific and contextual. Something that would only make sense on that particular day, in those particular conditions, that would not come up naturally in a routine radio call. If whoever is calling doesn't use that word, we do not comply. We do not return to camp. We go to the pre-agreed rally point, and we wait for visual confirmation before we move. Whatever was in that camp had studied Lyle long enough to replicate his voice, his gear, his approach angle, and his radio manner. It got almost everything right. What it didn't have was 11 days of accumulated specific detail, the knee, the gait, the duck foot on the downslope, the things you only carry because you were actually there, watching the same person move through the same terrain day after day. Pay attention to the small things. They are the only edge you have. If someone comes into your camp from the direction your partner went, and something is even slightly wrong, one thing that shouldn't need verification, but does trust that instinct completely, raise your voice toward where your partner actually is. Confirm the long way around. Don't let proximity and the right gear override what you know about the person you've been watching for 11 days. Whatever wears the face, it cannot wear the history. Not all of it, not enough. It can take the voice and the posture and the gear. What it cannot take is a bad knee and the specific way a man's foot turns out when the ground angles down. Those details belong to the person. The thing wearing them only has the surface. The surface will always give it away. You just have to look. Story 5. The fourth man on the deck. The harbor master filed the report. 3 crew, 1 boat. No explanation for the fourth set of boot prints on the deck. I was one of those 3 crew members. I was the one who noticed the prints. And I want to be careful about how I tell this because the easy version of this story makes it sound like a ghost story. And what happened on the water off Kodiak Island in October of 2018 was not a ghost story. A ghost story implies something from the past that can't touch you. What was on that boat with us could touch things just fine. We heard it do it all night long. My name is Trevor. I am a commercial fisherman working out of the St. Paul Harbor in Kodiak, Alaska, and I have been on the water in that region for 14 years. I run a 38-foot crab boat, a modified aluminum hull design built for the Gulf of Alaska with a 2-man crew. In October of 2018, my crew was my deckhand, Benny, who had worked with me for 3 seasons, and a fill-in deckhand named Walt, who was covering for my regular second man, who had broken 2 ribs in a dock accident the month before. We were working a string of pots in Chiniak Bay, southeast of the main island, in about 160 feet of water. The weather that week had been running 3 to 5 foot swells from the southwest, with intermittent rain and patchy fog, standard October in the Gulf of Alaska. Nothing unusual for that time of year. Conditions I had worked in more times than I could count. The Kodiak Archipelago in October is gray water and gray sky and the smell of salt and diesel and the particular cold that comes off the North Pacific in a way that gets into everything. I genuinely love working that water. Even after 14 years, I still find it satisfying in a way I've never been able to fully explain to people who haven't done it. We'd had a decent week. The pots were producing, the crab were clean and legal, and we were 2 days from the end of our permit window. Benny was in a good mood, which meant he was keeping up a running commentary on everything and nothing gear, other boats he'd seen on the radio, the comparative quality of various Kodiak harbors. And Walt was quieter, but competent and picking up the work pattern quickly. It was a good crew situation, easy. The kind of trip that reminds you why you're in the business. On the night this happened, we were anchored in a small bight off the northeast corner of Chiniak Bay, riding at anchor in maybe 30 feet of water behind a rock point that cut most of the southwest swell. The protection was good there, the boat barely moved, which mattered for sleep. The plan was to rest 4 hours, run the last string of pots starting at 4 in the morning, and be back at the harbor by early afternoon to offload. The fog had come in heavy around 9 that evening, and visibility was down to maybe 50 yards off the bow. The kind of fog that turns your anchor light into a glow and absorbs everything beyond it. The radar was showing clear, no traffic in the bay, nothing moving, and the anchor GPS was holding steady. I did a full check of the deck, the anchor rode, the pot gear lashed on the stern. Before I went below, Benny and Walt turned in around 10. I stayed up until 11, checking the anchor drag a second time and doing a final radar sweep of the bay, then went below myself. I set an alarm for 3:30 and I was asleep before 11:30. The anchor held, the bay stayed quiet. Everything was exactly as it should have been until 2:41 in the morning. I woke at 2:41 to the sound of footsteps on the deck above my bunk. This is not unusual on a working boat. Boats move at anchor, gear shifts, lines settle. You learn to filter those sounds from the sounds of actual weight moving across a deck. What I was hearing at 2:41 was the second type. Deliberate, evenly spaced, the specific percussion of a rubber boot on aluminum plate decking, moving aft from the bow along the port rail. I assumed it was Benny or Walt. I lay still and listened for about 30 seconds, half awake, waiting to hear hatch open or head door close, some indicator of what they were up to. The footsteps stopped near the stern. Then they moved forward again. Then they stopped. Then they moved again, on the starboard side this time, going aft to bow. I got up. The wheelhouse was empty. I checked the head empty. I opened the forward bunk door, and Benny was in his bunk and Walt was in his bunk, and both of them were asleep. I could hear Benny snoring, which I would recognize from 100 yards. I went back to the wheelhouse and stood there in the dark for a moment, listening to the boat and the water and the silence of the fog. The footsteps started again, port side, moving aft, slow, measured, the pace of someone walking a deck at night, being careful not to slip on wet aluminum. I tracked them to the stern, and then they stopped. 20 seconds of nothing. Then they started again, coming back up the starboard side, bowward, same pace. I opened the port side door and stepped out onto the rail deck. The fog was thick enough that my headlamp beam only penetrated about 15 feet before it scattered back at me off the moisture. I swept the deck port to stern empty. I moved aft to the working deck and swept the whole space, crab tanks dogged down, pot launcher undisturbed, nothing out of place. I went forward and checked the bow clear. I stood on the working deck with my headlamp off, letting my eyes adjust, and I listened. The water in the bight was almost dead calm. The anchor line had barely any catenary to it. The boat sat still on the surface of the bay, and the fog pressed in from every direction, and from directly above me, from the roof of the wheelhouse, there was a sound like something shifting its weight. A slow compression creak from the radar arch, the aluminum tube that brackets the radar unit above the wheelhouse roof. That arch is rated for the weight of the radar unit and nothing else. It only sounds like that when additional load is on it. I had heard it make that sound once before, when a deckhand had climbed up there to check the radar dome after an impact. Something was on the roof of my wheelhouse, in the fog, above the boat, in the dark, something heavy enough to load the radar arch. I went back inside and locked the door, and I woke Benny. I told him what I was hearing. He is not a person who dismisses things. 3 seasons on the water with me had given him enough experience with unexplained boat sounds to know the difference between gear settling and weight moving, and he got up without argument, pulled on his boots, and followed me forward to the wheelhouse. We stood together at the darkened wheelhouse windows and listened. The footsteps came again within about 2 minutes of us positioning their port side, moving aft, the same measured pace. We could both hear them clearly. Benny looked at me, and I looked at him, and neither of us said anything. He checked Walt's bunk himself. Walt was asleep, fully in his sleeping bag, snoring in the low, quiet way he snored. Benny came back to the wheelhouse and closed the door behind him. He said very quietly, "That's not Walt." I said I knew. He said, "So what is it?" I said I didn't know. That was honest. What I knew was what it wasn't. I didn't know what it was, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Benny accepted that the way experienced people accept the limits of available information. He nodded once and found a position on the bench seat where he could watch both the port and starboard windows, and he settled in and we began. The wait. For the next 4 hours, until the fog began to thin around 6:30 in the morning, something moved on that boat. It covered the full deck perimeter in a slow circuit, roughly every 20 minutes. It spent time on the bow, pausing there long enough that I could track it by the creak of the bow rail under load. It spent time on the stern. It went up on the wheelhouse roof twice more that we could confirm by the radar arch creak twice, same weight, same settling sound when it came back down. It never came below. It never tested a door handle or a hatch dog. It did not press itself against the windows. It simply moved in the methodical way of something following a route it had already mapped, patient and unhurried, as if it had nowhere else to be, and all the time the dark could give it. at around 1 in the morning and started talking. Not to us, not directed at us, not loud enough to be addressed to us. More like something speaking quietly to itself, or testing sounds the way you test a word in a language you're learning. What it was saying was our names. All three of them, in rotation, in voices that were almost right. My voice saying Benny's name, Benny's voice saying Walt's name, Walt's voice, which neither Benny nor I knew well enough to be certain about, saying mine. The voices cycled through in a sequence that had no conversational logic to it. Just name, pause, like a roster being read aloud by someone working from a list. The voices were not perfect. They were close enough that if I had been asleep and heard one through the hall, I might have thought it was one of my crew. But awake, focused, in a quiet wheelhouse, with nothing else competing for attention, I could hear what was wrong with them. The resonance was off, too much chest in each voice, too much resonance for the volume, like sound projected from something with more interior space than a human throat. And the cadence of the names was uniform in a way that human speech isn't. When you say someone's name in the dark to see if they're awake, there's inflection in it, a rise at the end, an interrogative quality. What we were hearing had no inflection. Flat delivery, same weight on every syllable, as if the concept of a question had not been fully acquired yet. We did not respond. We had agreed on that without discussing it. None of us reached for the radio, none of us called back, none of us made any sound we could avoid making. We sat in the dark wheelhouse with the radar running its slow sweep of the empty bay, and we breathed quietly and we waited. The hardest part of those 4 hours was the waiting. The movement and the voices were frightening, but they were external. They were happening out there, beyond the aluminum skin of the hull. The waiting was internal, and the waiting had its own quality that I have not been able to shake since that night. It was the awareness that something was orbiting the boat with apparent patience in the dark and the fog, and that it was learning us, and that there was nothing to do about that except wait for conditions it apparently found less useful. We were waiting for morning light. It was waiting for something else, though I still don't know what. At 2 in the morning, Walt woke up on his own and came forward from the bunk. He heard the voice cycling through the names while he was still in the bunk corridor, and he stopped and did not come further. He stood in the corridor in the dark and listened for about 5 minutes, and then he came into the wheelhouse and sat down without saying anything. He had heard enough to understand the situation. I handed him a coffee from the thermos that had been sitting on the chart table since before we went to anchor, and he took it without comment, and we sat together and drank coffee in the dark wheelhouse of a crab boat in the fog, while something walked our deck and said our names. There is a specific kind of calm that sets in after the fear has peaked, and there is nothing to do but endure something. I have felt it in bad weather, when the decision has been made to ride it out and there is nothing left but the waiting. It is not comfortable. It is not the absence of fear. It is fear that has been compressed into something functional, something that keeps you in your seat and your hands steady and your breathing even. We sat in that calm for 2 more hours, and we did not speak much, and we did not do anything that would have indicated to whatever was outside that we were affected by its presence. I don't know if that mattered. I don't know if it would have behaved differently if we had responded. I know that it did not escalate further than the walking and the voices, and that it stopped when the light came. At 6:17, the fog broke along the eastern horizon, and the first gray light started building over the Kodiak ridgeline. At 6:22, the footsteps stopped. Not gradually, just stopped, mid-circuit, between the stern and the port midship. The last sound was the radar arch settling back to its resting creak as weight came off it. Then nothing. We waited a full 20 minutes, watching the fog thin and the light build, before Benny went out first, and I followed, and Walt stood in the wheelhouse door. The deck was wet from the fog condensation. Every surface that holds moisture was holding it uniformly, the way a deck looks after a night of still fog with no foot traffic, except for one area. On the starboard rail deck, running from amidships to the stern, there was a track, not sharp-edged enough to read as individual prints. Aluminum in fog condensation doesn't hold definition the way mud or snow would. but a clear disruption in the uniform moisture film. A path. Two parallel lines of disturbed condensation spaced like a walking stride, extending about 20 feet along the starboard rail before fading back into the undisturbed surface. That was what Mr. Tollefson documented. The track, our statements, the GPS anchor log confirming our position hadn't moved, the radar log showing no other vessels had approached. He was a thorough man, and his report said what the evidence said and nothing beyond it. I respected that. Evidence is what you can point to. The rest of it, the voices, the 4 hours, the specific patience of whatever orbited that boat in the dark, that part lives in me and Benny and Walt and does not reduce to a line in a harbor report. Walt worked one more season on the water after that trip and then moved back to Washington State to work construction. He didn't make a big thing of leaving, just filed out of the permit system quietly and stopped answering calls about crew work. I ran into him at a fuel dock in Homer the following summer, and he looked fine, healthy, working. He didn't bring up that night, and I didn't either. Some things don't need to be revisited. The fact that we both know what happened is enough. The knowing doesn't require discussion. Benny's still deckhands for me. He has not said anything directly about that night since we filed the report, but I know it changed something in the way he works. The night anchor watch, he stays in the wheelhouse now, door-dogged, radar running, and he does not go out on deck alone after dark when we're sitting at anchor in the fog. He also started keeping a foghorn inside the wheelhouse rather than mounted outside, which I understood without asking. I don't blame him. I made the same changes. Different boat now sold the 38-footer 2 seasons ago, but same rules. The hull is the line, the light is the trigger. When the light comes, whatever used the dark goes with it. 14 years on this water. One rule I added after that October that I didn't have before. If you hear boot steps on a deck where nobody should be walking, don't go out to check. Turn on every light on the vessel. Stay inside, stay together, and wait for the water to let you leave. Whatever moves on that deck in the dark and the fog does not come below, it doesn't cross thresholds into enclosed spaces. The hull and the light together are its limit. Keep the hull between you. Wait for morning. The fog will lift, and whatever used the dark will be gone with it, and you will still be there, and that is the only outcome worth working toward. Story 6. The gate I left open, I'm the one who left the gate unlocked. What came through it is why I don't work trails anymore. I want to be clear about that from the start, not as a confession designed to make this story more interesting, but because the sequence matters. A gate left unlocked is a threshold left open, and whatever was moving through the Williwaw Lakes corridor that August understood thresholds in a way I did not. I was 24 years old and working a summer contract with the Chugach State Park trail crew out of the Eagle River Nature Center. The work was physical and mostly unglamorous, clearing drainage ditches, resetting erosion bars, replacing blowdown on the upper trails, doing whatever maintenance had accumulated over winter and the heavy use of the spring hiking season. The pay was reasonable for seasonal work, the hours were consistent, and being outside in the Chugach Mountains for 8 hours a day was better than most alternatives I could come up with at 24. It was good work and I was good at it, and I liked the people I was working with. My crew lead was a woman named Officer Britton, a park ranger who doubled as trail supervisor during the summer maintenance season. She was organized, precise, and had the specific patience of someone who had managed summer contract crews for a long time. The patience that is really just the accumulated knowledge of every mistake a crew can make, organized into a system for preventing them. There were 4 of us on the Williwaw Lake section that week. Me, a guy named Harlan who had worked trails for 3 seasons and was the closest thing we had to an institutional memory, and 2 other first-season workers whose names I won't use because they've asked me not to. The Williwaw Lakes Trail runs roughly 8 miles into the Chugach Front Range from the Eagle River trailhead, climbing through alder and willow bottom land before opening into a chain of alpine lakes in a cirque below the main peaks. It is a heavily used trail by Anchorage standards, and in August it can see several hundred visitors on a good weekend day. We were working on a Tuesday and Wednesday, midweek, lower traffic. The Chugach Front Range is not wilderness in the way that interior Alaska is wilderness. It sits directly behind Anchorage, close enough that you can see the city lights from the upper ridgelines on a clear night. But the drainages between the ridgelines hold a lot of standing timber and dense alder that can swallow a person in the middle distance without much effort. I had worked 3 sections of Chugach trails over 2 summers, and I had a good feel for the terrain. I thought I knew what to be alert for up there. I was wrong about that in a specific and instructive way. The trailhead has a vehicle gate, a metal pipe gate on a post, padlocked closed during off hours to manage vehicle access. During our work days, we opened it in the morning and closed and locked it at the end of the day when we pulled out. Standard procedure. Officer Britton had a checklist for end-of-day closeout that included the gate lock as item 6. On our second evening, Tuesday, I was the last person out. Harlan's truck had a mechanical issue and he needed to get it to the Eagle River shop before closing time, so he left early. The other 2 were splitting a vehicle and left about 20 minutes before me. I was packing the last of the tool cache into the Gaylord when Officer Britton radioed to say she'd had to respond to a welfare check on the upper Mirror Lake Trail and would meet me at the park office in the morning. She asked me to close the gate. I closed the gate. I walked through it, pulled it behind me, and I locked the hasp. Except I didn't fully seat the hasp. I was tired, and I was thinking about the 40-minute drive back to Anchorage and whether I needed to stop for fuel, and I dropped the padlock through the hasp loop without pulling it all the way down to engage the shackle. The lock was in the hasp. It looked locked. It was not locked. I drove away. The next morning, Officer Britton reached the trailhead before me and found the gate ajar. The padlock was hanging from the hasp unengaged. She logged the discrepancy and waited for me. When I arrived, she showed it to me and asked if I had locked the gate the previous evening. I told her I had. She showed me the padlock. I told her I thought I had. She wrote the incident in the duty log, and we moved on, because there was work to do. We were at the first drainage crossing, about a mile in, when Harlan said he'd heard something on the way up the trail that morning that he wanted to mention. He had come in early, before Officer Britton and before me, to check a drainage bar we'd set the previous day. Coming up the first mile of trail in the pre-dawn gray, around 5:30 in the morning, he had heard a voice ahead of him on the trail, a male voice, calling out as if greeting someone. He had assumed it was another early hiker and had called back. The voice had gone quiet. He'd walked another quarter mile and seen no one. No headlamp ahead on the trail. No sound of footsteps in either direction. He'd filed it under early hiker who turned around and moved on. He mentioned it the way experienced trail workers mention things they can't immediately categorize, not with alarm, but with the specificity of someone who wants a detail on record in case it connects to something later. He said the voice had sounded like it was maybe 50 yards ahead of him on the trail. He said it had called out a greeting in a conversational tone, the way hikers call out when they hear footsteps approaching on a narrow trail. He said when he called back there had been a pause too long for a natural conversation, about 3 seconds, and then silence. He had walked the next quarter mile with his headlamp on and seen nothing and no one. Officer Britton logged it. She didn't say what she thought about it. That was her way. She recorded what was reported and moved forward. I had worked enough trail seasons to appreciate that quality in a supervisor. You don't editorialize in the field log. You record facts, and you let the facts accumulate into whatever pattern they're building. We worked through the morning without incident. The day was clear, mid-60s, the kind of August weather that makes the Chugach feel like a different place than it is in October. We had hikers pass us going both directions through the morning families, trail runners, a group of older women with trekking poles who stopped to ask Harlan questions about the erosion bar work. Normal trail traffic. The kind of day where you stop thinking about anything except the work in front of you. Around 2 in the afternoon, we were above the lake basin, working a section of trail that had severe erosion from the previous winter's snowmelt. The trail there runs along a narrow bench above a steep drop to the lower lake. It is open and exposed, good sightlines in every direction. Not the kind of terrain where things can approach without being seen. We could see maybe a quarter mile of trail in both directions. No hikers had come through in about 40 minutes. The trail was quiet. At 2:17, I heard a voice below us from the direction of the lower lake. It cut through the quiet the way a sound does when there shouldn't be one, not loud but wrong against the silence. A male voice calling for help, not urgently, but in the flat, slightly strained way of someone who has turned an ankle and needs assistance. The voice said it needed help with its pack. It said it was on the bench trail below the first lake. I looked at Officer Britton. She was already scanning the trail below. There was nobody there. The trail below us was completely empty and visible for 200 yards in each direction. The voice called again. Same words, same inflection, same precise flatness to the help. Harlan had gone very still. He looked at me and said quietly, "That's the same voice I heard this morning." Officer Britton keyed her radio and did a sweep of the trail frequency, asking any visitors in the Willowa corridor to respond with their position. 3 parties responded. All of them were above us on the upper lake trail, none of them below us, none of them in distress. She confirmed all 3 positions and logged them. The voice below us called a 3rd time and then stopped. We packed our tools and started down. The descent took about 40 minutes at the pace Officer Britton set. Deliberate, observant, with Harlan at the front and me at the rear. We saw nobody on the lower trail. No hikers, no day visitors, no one. The trail was empty from the bench all the way to the first mile marker. That emptiness was notable because mid-afternoon on a clear August Tuesday should have had at least some foot traffic, day hikers heading down from the lakes, people finishing their loops. There had been nobody behind us on the descent, nobody ahead of us either. The trail felt evacuated in a way that trails don't usually feel evacuated, as if everything that understood the terrain had quietly found somewhere else to be. At about the half-mile mark, coming down through the alder thicket section, where the trail narrows and bends through dense vegetation, I smelled something. A specific smell, organic and wrong wet animal combined with something older beneath it, something that was less a smell than a quality of the air, the way very old, very dead things change the air around them. It was there for about 30 seconds, consistent and sourceless, and then the breeze shifted down the drainage, and it was gone. I said, "You smell that?" Harlan said yes without turning around. He said it quietly, without breaking stride, the way you answer a question when you don't want to talk about the answer. Officer Britton said to keep moving, and she said it in a tone that meant she had smelled it too, and we were not going to discuss it until we were somewhere other than that alder thicket. We came out of the alder section onto the lower open flat, 50 yards from the trailhead parking area and the gate. The parking area was visible from the trail, and something was standing at the gate, upright, tall, standing at the exact position of the gate, not on the park side and not on the roadside, but directly at the gate itself, at the metal bar of the gate with both hands on it. Standing there the way a person stands at a fence when they're looking through it at something. Except the gate opens inward and there was nothing to look through. It was facing the trail, facing us. It was wearing a hiking pack, standard external frame pack, the kind you see on trail every day. The proportions underneath the pack straps were wrong in ways I have already learned to describe. Arms too long below the cuff line, neck too far forward. The head angle slightly off from what a person produces when they're simply looking ahead. Officer Britton stopped us with one hand. She keyed her radio and called dispatch. She said there was an individual at the Willowa trailhead gate behaving in a manner consistent with being in distress or disoriented, and requested a unit check the road access. The thing at the gate had not moved while she spoke. It stood with its hands on the gate bar, and it looked at us, or performed the act that corresponded to looking without moving. Then it opened its mouth and it used my voice, not a version of my voice, not a close approximation. My voice, the specific register, the particular rhythm I use when I'm stating a fact I'm confident about, the slight flatness in my vowels that people from my part of Ohio always carry regardless of how long they've lived elsewhere. My voice, saying words I would never say in that situation, repurposed the way a recording is repurposed when someone splices it into a different sentence. It used my voice to say that the gate was locked and we should go around, calm, helpful, the tone of someone managing a situation. I have thought about this for years. Why my voice? Why not Officer Britton, who had had more time to listen to on the radio? Why not Harlan, who it had apparently heard on the trail at 5:30 that morning? I think the answer is the gate. I think it knew which one of us had left the gate open the night before. I think it had been using that open gate all night, and it knew whose mistake it was. I don't know how it knew. I have stopped trying to explain how it knew. Officer Britton said, behind me, "Nobody go near that gate." The unit that came in response was a park ranger named Officer Halverson, working the Chugach North District that day. She arrived within 15 minutes, and by the time she pulled into the parking area from the roadside, the gate was empty. No figure, no pack, no evidence of anyone having been there. She checked both shoulders of the access road for 50 yards in each direction and came back with nothing to report. She was professional about it, and she did not suggest we had imagined anything. She simply noted the absence of physical evidence and moved to taking our statements. She took our statements at the trailhead in the parking area, the four of us standing near our trucks, the evening coming on fast in the drainage, the way it does in the Chugach when the ridgelines cut off the direct light. She wrote everything down in the same careful way. Officer Britton took notes, facts, times, physical descriptions, the sequence of events. She did not speculate. She did not offer explanations. She asked whether any of us had taken photographs. We hadn't. She asked whether the voice we had heard calling for help from the lower trail had been at any point recorded on Officer Britton's radio. Officer Britton pulled the radio log. The transmissions Officer Britton had made were recorded, but ambient sound during those transmissions was not. No recording of the voice existed. She logged the incident under case number CSPAK2308-7. She asked Officer Britton separately. At the edge of the parking area, though, I was close enough to hear whether there had been any prior incidents in that corridor. Officer Britton said there had been one report 6 weeks earlier from a trail crew working the upper basin, a figure on the trail at night that had not corresponded to any registered camper in the park system. She said the earlier report had been logged and forwarded, and she had not heard back about it. Officer Halverson said she would forward our report to the appropriate division. She said it the way people say things that are procedurally required and personally inadequate to the situation. I finished the week's contract. I did not renew for the following summer. I told Officer Britton it was a scheduling conflict. She said she understood. She may have believed me. I have always thought she probably did not, and that she was giving me a graceful exit because she understood why someone would want one. That night, in the Willowa corridor is mine to carry. I left the gate open. Whatever used it in the hours between my mistake and morning, I don't know what it found, what it learned, what it did in the dark inside that trailhead. The not knowing is the part that has stayed longest. Thresholds matter. Gates, doors, boundaries, whatever uses that corridor understands them and looks for the ones that have been left unattended. It waits for the careless moment, the tired end of a shift, the one item on the checklist performed by habit instead of attention. Close every gate, seat every lock. Check it, then check it again. The second check takes 10 seconds. The alternative costs considerably more. Don't be the person who left it open. Story 714 entries. The motion sensor log shows 14 entries between midnight and 4 a.m. I was the only person on site. The footage shows someone else. I want to be specific about what I mean by someone else, because the footage is not what you might expect from a story like this. There is no figure lurching through a dark building. There is no clear dramatic image of something wrong. What the footage shows, across 14 motion events over 4 hours, is the same thing in every clip. A column of darkness that moves against the background darkness in a way that suggests depth and shape, suggests a body, a volume of space that isn't empty but never resolves into anything the camera can fully capture, a negative image, something defined by what it displaces rather than what it reflects. I watched that footage 47 times before I stopped. I have not watched it since. My name is Grant. I worked overnight security for a private firm contracted to a heavy equipment storage yard in Fairbanks, Alaska, from October of 2016 through March of 2017. The yard was about 12 acres, fenced on all four sides, with 8-foot chain link topped with 3 strands of barbed wire. Inside the fence was a mix of equipment in various states of repair bulldozers, excavators, a row of flatbed trailers, several portable light towers, and 2 equipment sheds that held smaller machinery and parts inventory. The main office building sat near the front gate, a prefab structure with a heated security room that had a monitor bank for the 16 cameras positioned around the yard. The yard was well lit during operating hours. At night, the perimeter lights stayed on sodium vapor fixtures on poles at each corner and at intervals along the fence line, but the interior went dark except for the equipment shed security lights, which were on motion sensors. The effect was a lit perimeter and a dark interior, which meant that anything moving inside the fence was moving in relative darkness while being framed by the perimeter light behind it. Good conditions for the cameras, good conditions for something that understood the light distribution. I thought about that a lot afterward. The layout of that yard, the bright perimeter, the dark center, the specific camera angles and their blind spots was not something a person could learn in a single night of casual observation. Whatever moved through that yard on January 9th had a working knowledge of the camera geometry. It stayed in the gaps. It used the threshold spaces, the narrow zones between defined camera fields, the way someone uses a map they have studied in advance, 14 entries, not one of them positioned in the open center of any camera field. The first 3 months of my contract were without incident. Night shift at a storage yard in interior Alaska in winter is not an eventful posting. The temperature drops to -40 on bad nights and nothing much moves. The yard's owners checked in once a week. I walked the perimeter twice a shift and otherwise monitored the cameras and did whatever quiet work filled the hours. I read. I had a space heater and a good thermos and a standing routine that got me through the shift without the hours becoming oppressive. It was lonely work, and I was good at it. Fairbanks in January has a specific quality at night that I want you to understand, because it matters to what happened. The cold at that level, -30, -35, does something to sound. Sound doesn't carry the way it does in temperate climates. The air is too dense, too still, too cold to carry vibration at normal distances. The yard at 2 in the morning in that temperature was genuinely silent in a way that most people have never experienced. Not quiet, silent. The only sounds were the ones I made myself and the occasional tick of metal contracting in the cold. That silence made the motion sensor entries louder, in a psychological sense, than anything I have experienced before or since. Each entry was a disturbance in something that should have been completely undisturbed. The motion sensor log is a digital record kept by the security system, time-stamped entries generated every time a camera or PIR sensor detected movement. On a normal night, I would see 2 to 4 entries from my own perimeter walks, occasionally 1 or 2 more from small animals, ravens landing on equipment, the yard's resident fox cutting through on its rounds, a particularly bold moose that had found a way under the fence on the south side twice in November before facilities patched the gap. The entries were logged automatically, and I reviewed them each morning before shift change, and for 3 months the logs had been clean and unremarkable, and I had stopped thinking about them as anything other than a paperwork formality. On the morning of January 10th, I pulled the log and read 14 entries I could not account for, spanning 4 hours, and I have thought about those entries every day since. On the night of January 9th, I came in at 10 p.m., and the yard was empty and quiet. The temperature outside was -31. I did my first perimeter walk at 11, logged 2 entries from my own movement, and settled in for the night. I had a book I was partway through and a thermos of coffee. and the camera monitors in front of me, and nothing unusual happening anywhere. At 12:07 a.m., the log registered an entry from camera 11. Camera 11 covered the north interior of the yard, the row of flatbed trailers parked in the middle left section of the property. I looked at monitor 11. The image showed the dark interior of the yard, with the perimeter light behind and in the frame, between two of the flatbed trailers, a column of darker darkness that had not been there in the previous sweep. I watched the monitor. The column did not move for about 90 seconds. Then it was gone. Not moving out of frame, gone, the way a shadow disappears when the light that cast it changes. I logged the entry as a possible wildlife incident and continued monitoring. At 12:19, camera 7 triggered. Camera 7 covered the west side of the equipment shed. I looked at monitor 7 and there it was again, the same column of dark, standing against the equipment shed wall in a position that would have required it to move from the north interior to the west perimeter in under 12 minutes through a yard that had no cover between those 2 points. I had been watching the monitors. Nothing had moved across the open ground between those positions. It had relocated without crossing any of the space between. That was the moment I understood I was not dealing with an animal. I picked up the phone and called my dispatch supervisor, a man named Mr. Sorensen, who ran the overnight desk for the security firm from an office in Anchorage. I told him I had anomalous motion sensor activity and possible unauthorized presence in the yard, and I was requesting guidance. He asked whether I had visual confirmation of an intruder. I told him the cameras were showing something, but it was not resolving clearly. He told me to document, stay in the office building, and he would send a check-in call at 2 a.m. He said it in a tone that meant he thought I had seen a fox. I went back to the monitors. The column was gone from camera 7. I sat and I watched all 16 monitors, and I waited. Camera 3 triggered at 12:44. Camera 3 was the front gate, exterior camera, the camera that covered the entrance to the yard from the outside, aimed back at the gate and the approach road. The column was at the gate, on the outside. Between my last confirmed interior sighting at camera 7 and this exterior sighting, something had passed through the 8-foot chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, without triggering any of the fence line sensors, without appearing on any of the intermediate cameras, and was now standing outside the fence looking in. I stood up from my chair. I checked the fence line sensor log. Clean. Nothing had triggered it between camera 7's entry and camera 3's entry 6. Cameras covered the fence line, and none of them had registered movement. Either whatever this was had gone over or through that fence without contacting it, or it had passed through it in a way that the sensors could not detect. Neither option was acceptable. Both options were what the evidence showed. The gate was locked. I had checked it at the start of shift. I pulled up the gate camera image and confirmed the chain was on the gate. It was clearly visible, wrapped twice through the gate bars and the post bracket, padlocked. The column stood outside the locked gate for 41 seconds, entirely still, and then the camera entry ended. The next entry was camera 14, north interior, 31 seconds later. It had come back through the fence, through the locked gate, or through the chain link itself. I do not know which. I know it was outside, and then it was inside, and the fence between those two states had not registered its passage. Camera 14 triggered at 1 a.m., camera 9 at 1:18, camera 2 at 1:44. Between each entry, I sat at the monitor bank and watched all 16 feeds simultaneously, and I never saw it move between positions. It simply stopped appearing in one location and started appearing in another, each new location in a threshold, space, doorways, gate posts, the narrow gap between trailer hitches, the junction between the equipment shed wall and the portable light tower base. Always in the boundary zone, always where one defined space met another. By 2 a.m, I had stopped trying to track its movements predictively. There was no pattern I could identify. It did not work its way around the yard in a circuit. It did not return to previous positions in any order I could map. It appeared where it appeared, and then it was somewhere else. And the only consistent rule was the threshold preference, and the duration each appearance lasted between 15 seconds and 4 minutes. And none of them were in the open ground at the center of any camera field. I sat in that security room and I watched the monitors, and I drank cold coffee and I waited. The temperature outside dropped to -38 by the 3 a.m. reading on the exterior sensor. The yard was completely silent except for the occasional distant sound of a vehicle on the highway a quarter-mile west, and those sounds were infrequent and far away and did not help. The final entry was at 3:52 a.m. camera 6, the south equipment shed exterior, where the column stood for the longest continuous duration of the night, 4 minutes and 11 seconds by the timestamp. It stood at the corner of the equipment shed where the building's wall met the fence line, the junction of two boundaries, the building threshold and the yard perimeter at the same point, and it did not move at all during those 4 minutes. It simply stood there at that double threshold, and whatever it was doing in those 4 minutes, I was not able to determine from the camera image. When the entry ended, the log stayed clean until my own perimeter walk at 5:30, when the sky was beginning to lighten and the temperature was already climbing back toward -20. 14 entries. 14 positions across a 12-acre yard over 4 hours, moving without pattern and without crossing the open ground between positions in any way the cameras captured. And between each position, that column of dark that was not quite resolvable always in the threshold spaces, doorways, gateposts, the narrow gap between trailer hitches, the space between the equipment shed wall and the portable light tower base, always in the threshold, always at the boundary between one defined space and another. Mr. Sorensen's 2 a.m. check-in call went to voicemail. I did not call him back. I turned on every light in the security office, the overheads, the desk lamp, the emergency exit light I unplugged from its bracket and aimed at the door. I sat with all of that light around me, and I watched the monitors, and I did not go back outside until the sky started to gray up well after 7 in the morning, at which point the temperature outside was still -29, but the darkness was receding, and I could see the full yard in the pale winter light, and nothing in it was moving. I did my final perimeter walk in full daylight, which was outside my shift parameters, but I did not care. The yard was undisturbed in every observable way. The equipment was where it had been. The sheds were locked. The gate chain was intact and locked, exactly as I had left it at shift start. There were no tracks in the snow inside the fence line, except my own. From the 11 p.m. walk, the snow surface between my footprints and the fence was smooth and unbroken. Whatever had been moving through that yard all night had left no physical trace in the snow. I filed a full shift report, including the motion sensor log printout and a notation that the camera footage from those 14 events required review. My supervisor reviewed the footage 2 days later and called me. He did not say much. He asked me how long I had been on overnight posting. I told him 5 months total over 2 contracts. He said the footage had been forwarded to the yard's owner and to the firm's technical department for review. He said the technical department's preliminary assessment was a camera calibration anomaly producing false motion detections. He said that in a tone that told me he had watched the footage himself and did not believe his own. Explanation. I did not argue with him. The report was filed. The footage existed. 47 viewings later, I knew everything about that footage that I was going to know, and none of it resolved into anything I could name. I finished my contract in March and did not renew. I have done day shift security work since then, and I have been careful about the sites I take. I do not take yards or facilities with large, unfenced interior spaces. I do not take overnight postings in remote locations. I have turned down 2 contracts that paid significantly more than what I currently make because the site specifications match the Fairbanks yard too closely. Large exterior space, perimeter lighting, dark interior, isolated location. I take enclosed buildings with solid exterior walls, and I take day shifts. And I have not seen anything on a monitor since that night in January that I cannot identify and explain. The footage still exists, as far as I know. The firm archived shift recordings for 2 years. Whether anyone has reviewed it since I left, or whether it simply aged off into a deleted archive folder, I don't know. I have not requested a copy. I watched it 47 times, and I know everything about it that I am going to know. Watching it again would not give me new information. It would only refresh things I have been working for years to let settle. If you work overnight security in a large exterior space, a yard, a lot, a staging area, any facility with a lit perimeter and a dark interior track where things appear between positions, not just where they appear. An animal moves through space continuously, and you can follow it camera to camera in real time. What I watched that January move between spaces without crossing the space between them, as if the yard were a floor plan of thresholds it had already memorized. Note every sensor entry. Timestamp everything. Keep the motion log running. And if that log shows 14 entries and you only accounted for 2, turn on every light you have access to, get inside the building, and wait for the light to come back. Do not go outside to check. Do not walk a perimeter. The dark is not your environment. It is theirs. Stop walking into it. Copy Story 8, the Checkpoint Report. This comes from a Coast Guard no. Let me start again. This comes from a checkpoint volunteer log. The race officials sealed the report. I'm telling you anyway, because you need to know what's out on that trail. I spent 3 seasons volunteering at Iditarod checkpoints before what happened at the Nikolai to McGrath stretch in March of 2015 ended that for me. I had worked Roan, Nikolai, and a remote trail checkpoint called Slow Creek that sits about 40 miles out of McGrath in a stretch of the trail that crosses the Farewell Burn, a vast area of dead and regenerating spruce that burned in 1977 and never fully came back, leaving miles of open ghost forest and exposed ground that feels more like the surface of another planet than any part of Alaska I have seen before or since. I want to tell you something about the Farewell Burn before I get into what happened, because the landscape matters to this story in a way that is not just atmospheric. The burn is roughly 400 square miles of terrain that was fundamentally altered in a single summer and has been in a state of slow, incomplete recovery ever since. What you get is standing dead timber, silver-gray spruce trunks with no bark left, no branches below 10 feet, stripped by the fire and the years of weather since rising from a ground cover that is trying to be forest again and not quite getting there. It is a landscape that is neither one thing nor another, not dead, not alive, not forest, not open country. It exists in a threshold state, and I think now that threshold states attract certain kinds of attention. The Iditarod is a logistical operation as much as it is a race, and the checkpoints are its nodes. At Slow Creek, which is a remote supply cache rather than a fully staffed facility, there were 2 of us, me and a woman named Elena, who had been doing remote checkpoint work for 11 years and was the most competent wilderness operator I have ever met. She had a methodical calm that I found genuinely reassuring in the field, the kind of calm that comes from having made good decisions under pressure enough times that it has become habitual. I trusted her judgment completely, and her judgment that something in the Farewell Burn felt wrong is a significant part of why I take what happened seriously enough to tell it now. The checkpoint consisted of a wall tent with a wood stove, a cache of dog food and supplies, a satellite phone for emergency communication, and a VHF radio on the race frequency. We had snow machines for our own mobility and emergency egress. Our job was to record each musher's bib number and arrival time as they came through, confirm they were in good condition, resupply them from the cache if needed, and transmit their departure time to race communications. It is unglamorous work at the field level, filling out cards, monitoring radio traffic, keeping the dog food from freezing solid, but it is the work that makes the race function. And Elena ran it with the efficiency of someone who had done it enough times to remove all unnecessary motion from the process. The first mushers came through Slow Creek on day 5 of the race. They came through in waves, the faster teams first, and then the mid-pack over a period of about 18 hours, and then the back of the field in a long scattered sequence over the following day. We had been at the checkpoint for 2 days before the lead teams arrived, and those 2 days of waiting in the farewell burn in March cold clear weather, temperatures ranging from -15 to -30 overnight, the ghost forest standing around us in every direction, had already given both Elena and me a specific feeling about that location that I did not know how to name at the time. What I know now is that it felt watched. The farewell burn is open enough that you can see a long distance in most directions. The standing dead spruce rise from the snow at intervals, skeletal and silver gray, and between them the ground cover is low and sparse willow scrub, knee-high regenerating spruce that won't be real trees for another 20 years, and open snow between them all. There is no dense cover. Whatever is out there should be visible, and mostly what is out there are moose, ravens, and the occasional wolf that cuts across the burn on its own business. That openness is part of what makes the checkpoint there feel exposed in a way that denser terrain doesn't. You can see far. Whatever is out there can also see far. In 2 days of watching that landscape, I saw one moose on the afternoon of our first day, browsing the willow scrub on the western edge, and heard ravens every morning, and saw no wolves. What I saw on the second evening before the first teams arrived was a shape moving along the tree line at the burn's eastern edge, upright, bipedal, moving at a human walking pace, at a distance of maybe 400 yards, too far to resolve into detail. I watched it for about 30 seconds through the binoculars before it entered a standing dead spruce thicket, and I lost it entirely. Upright, walking, 400 yards out in the farewell burn at -22 degrees in early March, I told Elena. She took the binoculars and looked at the thicket for a long, still moment. Then she lowered them and she said, "That happens out here." She said it the way people say things when they want to close a subject without lying about it. I let her close it because I did not yet have the framework to push back. The race traffic came through over the next 2 days without incident. We recorded bib numbers and times, resupplied teams, passed information to race communications. Routine checkpoint work. The lead teams were fast and efficient. They knew the checkpoint drill. They took what they needed. They moved on. The mid-pack came through in a more varied rhythm, some teams resting longer, some pushing through quickly. We fed mushers, watered dogs, filled out cards. The rhythm of checkpoint work has its own momentum, and it is a good thing to have momentum when a location feels the way Slow Creek felt. The feeling of being watched did not go away, but it did not escalate into anything I could report or act on. It sat at the edge of every hour the way background noise sits at the edge of concentration, always present, never quite loud enough to name. Elena and I did not discuss it. We had work to do, and we did it, and that was the right call in both directions. What I noticed during those 2 days of race traffic was that none of the dogs behaved oddly when they were in the checkpoint itself. No barking at the tree line, no hackles, nothing. The odd behavior Tyler described was on the approach trail, in the burn, before the checkpoint. Whatever was out there seemed to understand the difference between the checkpoint, a lit, occupied, active human space, and the trail. It worked in the in-between. On day 7 of the race, when the mid-pack had cleared and we were waiting for the slower teams, something changed in the radio traffic. The race frequency carries a lot of voice traffic during the event, mushers calling in positions, checkpoint coordinators relaying status, veterinarians requesting information on specific dogs, race officials communicating logistics. Elena and I monitored it continuously. We knew the voices of the race officials and the other checkpoint coordinators by that point, and we knew the mushers by their bib numbers, if not always by their voices. At 9:41 p.m. on day 7, the race frequency carried a transmission that identified itself as coming from bib number 37. The musher running bib 37 at that point in the race was a veteran named Mr. Cahill, who had run the Iditarod 11 times and whose voice and radio manner Elena knew well from prior seasons. The transmission said bib 37 was approximately 6 miles out from Slow Creek on the inbound trail, was running strong, and expected arrival at Slow Creek in about 45 minutes. Elena keyed the radio and acknowledged. Standard procedure. She noted the time and began prepping the resupply cache for a 6-dog team, which was Mr. Cahill's registered team count for that year. I started heating water for the mushers' food and set out the drop bags. 43 minutes later, Mr. Cahill's headlamp appeared on the trail from the direction of Nikolai, exactly on the schedule the transmission had predicted. His team was moving well. He arrived, signed in, took his resupply without drama, and while his dogs rested in harness, he sat by our stove and drank hot broth and talked about the trail conditions, the way experienced mushers talk factual, brief, useful information for anyone running behind him. Elena, filling in his checkpoint card without looking up, asked him in a conversational tone how his radio had been performing in the stretch between Nikolai and Slow Creek. He said fine, no issues. She asked whether he'd had any trouble with his position call coming in, said it had sounded a little garbled on our end. He paused for a moment over his broth and then said he hadn't called in since Nikolai. Said he'd been running hard through the burn and hadn't needed to. Elena wrote something on the card. She did not look up. Elena kept writing on the checkpoint card. She did not look up. She said, must have been interference. She caught my eye across the tent, and I saw in her face what I felt in my chest, which was the specific cold that is not weather. She held it together the way she held everything together. Her expression did not change. Her voice, when she thanked Mr. Cahill and wished him a good run to McGrath, was exactly the same voice she always used at checkpoint departures. 11 years of fieldwork had given her a surface that did not break easily. Mr. Cahill's team left after 90 minutes, and we were alone again at Slow Creek. The trail was dark in both directions, and the farewell burn spread out around us under a clear sky and a temperature that had dropped to -28. Elena pulled up the radio log. We had a digital recorder running on the race frequency for race documentation purposes, and we listened to the 941 transmission again. In the quiet of the checkpoint tent, with the wood stove ticking in the cold, it was Mr. Cahill's voice. The cadence was right, the radio manner was right, the specific way he clipped his words when transmitting on a shared frequency was right, the economy of speech that experienced race radio users develop, the particular phrasing of a man who had called in positions on this same frequency 11 times over 11 years. Everything was right, except the fact that Mr. Cahill had not made that call. Something out on the trail between Nikolai and Slow Creek had used Mr. Cahill's voice on the active race frequency to call in his position, approximately 45 minutes before he arrived. It had known his bib number. It had known his approximate position on the trail with enough accuracy to predict his arrival time to within 3 minutes. It had replicated his radio voice and his communication manner closely enough that Elena, who knew him personally across multiple race seasons, had accepted it in real time without hesitation. We sat in the quiet of the tent and listened to the recording twice and did not say anything for a while. We did not discuss what that meant while we were still at the checkpoint. We had 4 more teams still to come through, and we ran the rest of the checkpoint without incident. 2 of the remaining mushers, coming through separately over the following 12 hours, each reported the same thing when Elena carefully asked about their radio traffic. They had not made position calls in the stretch between Nikolai and Slow Creek. Something had called in their positions for them. Something that knew their bib numbers, their approximate locations on the trail, and their pace well enough to provide accurate estimated arrivals. One of them, a younger musher named Tyler, who was running his second Iditarod, mentioned something else. As he came through the farewell burn on the approach to Slow Creek, his Lead dog had pulled hard to the right twice off the marked trail toward the eastern tree line in a way she had never done on any other section of trail in his experience with her. He'd corrected her both times, assuming it was distraction. He'd seen nothing in the direction she was pulling toward. But he said the dog's behavior had been emphatic, not curious. She had not been pulling toward something interesting. She had been pulling away from something that was too close. Dogs know. I believe that now more than I believe most things I learned in those 3 seasons on the trail. We filed a full checkpoint report at the end of our rotation. Under incident notes, I described the 9:41 transmission, Mr. Cahill's denial, the 2 subsequent musher reports of unauthorized transmissions on the race frequency, and Tyler's lead dog behavior. I described the shape I had seen on the first evening at the tree line. Eleanor reviewed my notes, added 2 observations of her own that she had not mentioned to me during the rotation: a set of tracks in the snow at the eastern edge of the camp perimeter on the morning of day 2 that she had not been able to identify by species, and a period of approximately 20 minutes on day 3 when the race radio had produced static on a frequency it should have been clean on and countersigned the full report. We filed it through Race Communications to the Iditarod Race Management Office in Anchorage. The Race Management Office sent us a confirmation of receipt 4 days after the race concluded. 3 weeks after that, I received a letter stating that the incident report had been reviewed by the Race Communications Committee and the anomalous transmissions attributed to atmospheric radio ducting a real phenomenon in which temperature inversions allow radio signals to travel far beyond their normal range and occasionally reflect back in modified form. It is a real phenomenon. It does not explain how the reflected transmission knew Mr. Cahill's bib number, his current position on the trail, and his accurate estimated arrival time. It does not explain the tracks. It does not explain the dog. The report was marked closed. Elena and I have not spoken directly about any of it since we came off rotation. She still volunteers on the race. I do not. I have not gone back to the farewell burn, and I do not plan to. If you are traveling a remote trail, any remote trail, not just the Iditarod corridor, and you hear a radio transmission that identifies you or gives you information about your position before you have made contact with the checkpoint ahead, do not act on it. Do not adjust your route based on what it tells you. Do not respond on the frequency at all. Whatever is generating that transmission knows your voice, your bib number, your approximate location, and your pace. It is using the radio the way it uses voices, not to communicate but to redirect, to move you off the marked route and into the open ground between checkpoints where there is no one to confirm what happens next. Get to the checkpoint by your own dead reckoning and your own pace. Confirm everything in person with a human being you can see. Trust the marked trail over any instruction that comes through a radio you cannot verify. And trust your dogs. Whatever is out on that trail in the farewell burn, the dogs have always known it was there before the mushers did. Tyler's lead dog was not distracted. She was reading the terrain the way dogs read terrain when something is close and wrong, not curiosity, not aggression, evasion. She was trying to give him a wider berth from something on the eastern tree line that was much closer than 400 yards by then. He corrected her. He didn't know why she was doing it. Now he does. Stay on the marked trail. Trust your dogs. They have better information than you do. Story 9, the third set of prints. When we reached the ridge at dawn, both sets of our boot prints in the snow had a third set walking between them. It had been there the whole time. I want to walk you through this carefully because the specific geometry of what we found matters more than the drama of how we reacted to it. We were calm. We are both the kind of people who stay calm under pressure and think through evidence before they start naming things. We stood on that ridge in the early light with the Brooks Range spreading out around us in every direction, and we looked at those 3 lines of prints in the snow, and we talked through every explanation we could construct, and none of them held up. None of them held up because the third set of prints had no origin point. They began in the middle of our trail, between our own prints, as if whoever or whatever had been walking there had simply appeared into the middle of our line of travel and kept moving with us for the rest of the night. My name is Nolan. The person I was hiking with is my friend and regular backcountry partner, a man named Cole. We have done extended trips together in the Alaska Range, in the Wrangells, and in the Chugach over the course of about 7 years. We are not inexperienced people, and we are not the kind of people who tell stories like this at campfires. The fact that I am telling this one is the clearest indication I can offer of how seriously I take what happened. In late August of 2022, we were 8 days into a 12-day traverse in gates of the Arctic National Park, working a route through the central Brooks Range between the North Fork of the Koyukuk River and a pickup point near Anaktuvuk Pass. This is genuinely remote terrain, no trails, no maintained infrastructure, no cell service, no other parties in our visible range on any day of the trip. The nearest road is the Dalton Highway, several days' travel to the east. We had a satellite communicator, paper maps of the entire route, a GPS for confirmation, and 11 days of food. We had been through terrain like this before, and we moved well in it. The Brooks Range in late August is transitional country. The tundra at elevation has already turned, the low growth burning red and orange against the gray rock of the ridgelines, and the first hard frosts are arriving at night. Caribou are moving south in scattered groups, and wolves follow the caribou. Grizzly bears are in hyperphagia, feeding constantly before denning. It is genuinely wild country, in the most literal sense, not wild because it is dramatic, but wild because it operates entirely on its own logic, and human presence in it is incidental. We had seen a grizzly on day 3, a single boar working a blueberry slope about half a mile below our line of travel. We had given him a wide berth, and he had not looked up from the berries. We had seen caribou every day from day 4 onward, small groups and occasionally larger ones strung out across the tundra in that loose, purposeful way they move when they have somewhere specific to be. We had heard wolves once, on day 6, calling across a drainage well to the west 3 or 4 animals, the calls overlapping in a way that maps distance and direction, and had seen their tracks the following morning crossing a gravel bar below our campsite. Normal Gates country in late August. Everything accountable. Everything identifiable. Nothing that made us feel anything other than alert and appropriately careful. Up until the afternoon of day 8, nothing in that trip had produced a feeling that was outside the range of ordinary backcountry experience in serious terrain. I want to be clear about that because it matters to how seriously I take what came after. We were not spooked people looking for anomalies. We were experienced people who found one. The first thing I noticed that didn't belong was on the afternoon of day 8, while we were crossing a long tundra bench above the tree line. We had been traveling for about 4 hours since our midday camp break, and I was monitoring my footing on wet tundra tussocks. Gates tundra at that elevation is a minefield of ankle-twisting tussock mounds, and I had been watching my feet closely when I looked up for a moment to check our bearing and noticed that my shadow was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly. The light was coming from the southwest, low and directional, the way late afternoon light is at that latitude in late August, and our shadows were casting long and clear across the tundra ahead of us. 2 shadows, mine and Cole's, stretching easily 30 feet across the open ground. Except for a period of maybe 3 minutes, there appeared to be a third shadow positioned between them. Not as long as ours, somewhat shorter, suggesting a smaller form but distinct, parallel, moving at our pace. I stopped and turned around. There was nothing between Cole and me. He was about 15 feet behind me on the route, moving at his usual steady pace, watching his own footing. Nothing between us. Open tundra in every direction. When I turned back forward, the shadow between ours was gone. I stood there for a moment looking at the ground, and then I attributed it to the irregular tussock surface throwing complex shadow patterns at the low-angle light, which is a genuine effect on that kind of terrain, and I kept moving. I did not mention it to Cole that afternoon. I filed it in the category of explainable things and moved on. That was the wrong category. We made camp at around 6 in the evening in a sheltered depression below a long ridge that we intended to cross the following morning for our approach toward Anaktuvuk. We ate, checked in on the satellite communicator, reviewed the next day's route on the map, and were in our sleeping bags before 9. The light fades slowly at that latitude in late August. Genuine dark doesn't come until well after 10, and I fell asleep while the sky was still a deep blue-gray. I woke once during the night, at what felt like 2 in the morning, by the quality of the darkness, for no reason I could identify. Not a sound, not movement, just the abrupt return to consciousness that sometimes happens in the back country when some ambient threshold shifts without producing a specific identifiable stimulus. I lay still and listened for about 3 minutes. Wind, very light, from the north. The tent fabric barely moving. No sound that was out of place, except for one thing, which I did not register as significant until the following morning when we found the prints. The silence around the tent was total, in a way that went slightly beyond what weather and temperature would explain. No small animal sounds, no wind rustle in the low vegetation, no distant bird, just nothing, in a complete radius around the tent, as if the normal ambient life of the tundra had cleared a perimeter. I noted it vaguely and filed it as the kind of stillness that sometimes precedes a weather change, and went back to sleep. I was wrong about what it was, but I was right that something had changed. We broke camp at 5:45 in the morning when the sky was beginning to lighten from true black to the pale gray that precedes dawn at that elevation. Cole checked the weather while I packed my kit. The satellite communicator had a basic forecast function and said it was clear with a 20% chance of afternoon precip. Good traveling weather. We were on the move by 6:15, roped into the ridge approach, moving across the snowfield that covered the upper bench below the ridge crest. The snowfield was a remnant patch, maybe 200 meters across and 50 deep, left over from the previous winter on a north-facing slope. The snow was firm, good for travel, and it held our prints cleanly deep, sharp-edged impressions from our boot soles, spaced at our exact stride length. We crossed it, moving roughly northeast, Cole in front, me behind, our route a slightly diagonal line across the snow from southwest to northeast. We gained the ridge at 6:51 in the morning. The first light was full on the ridge crest, and the Brooks Range was spread out in every direction, the kind of view that stops you even when you've seen mountains before. Then Cole said, very quietly, "Look at the snow." I looked. 3 sets of prints crossed the snowfield below us, our 2 sets exactly as we had made them, our stride lengths and boot patterns clear and consistent, and between them running the full length of the field from the point where we had stepped onto the snow to the point where we had stepped off it, a 3rd set, same direction of travel, same approximate pace. Stride length slightly shorter than mine, slightly longer than Cole's size between us, precisely between us, as if whatever had made them was matched to our average. The 3rd prints began at the exact point where we had stepped onto the snow from the tundra. There was no tundra impression before that point, no compressed vegetation, no disturbed frost, nothing that indicated the 3rd set had been walking behind us on the tundra before we reached the snow. They simply started at the snow's edge, as if they had been placed there from above. We went back down and checked. We walked the full length of the snowfield's edge on the approach side. Our tundra impressions were visible, slight depressions in the frost-stiffened vegetation showing where we had stepped. There were no corresponding impressions for the 3rd set. On the tundra, there had been only 2 of us. On the snow, there had been 3. Cole is an engineer. He's a person who solves problems by eliminating variables one at a time until what remains is the answer, and he applied that method to the prints on that ridge with the same focus he applies to everything technical. He went back down to the snowfield entry point. He walked the full perimeter of the snow patch, examining the edge for any indication of a 3rd approach line from any angle. He crouched at each corner of the middle print set and examined the print margins with his headlamp still clipped to his pack strap. He stood back and looked at the geometry from 10 feet, 20 feet, from above on the ridge. He spent about 7 minutes on this before he came back to where I was standing. He said, "I don't have an explanation for this. I said I didn't either. He said, "The prints are real. They're in the snow." They weren't there when we came through because we would have seen them. I was watching the snow surface, the whole crossing for crust stability, and there was nothing between our tracks. He paused. So they were made while we were crossing. While I was in front and you were behind, and there was nothing between us that either of us saw or felt. I said yes, he said, and they start where we stepped onto the snow and end where we stepped off it. No approach, no departure, just present for the duration of our crossing. I said yes. We stood on that ridge for a long time looking at the snowfield below and the 3 lines of prints crossing it. The Brooks Range spread out behind us, vast and indifferent, and exactly the same as it had been 5 minutes before, and the prints were exactly what they were, and there was no version of the landscape that made them acceptable. The middle set was cleaner than ours in one specific way that Cole identified, and that I confirmed when I crouched next to one and looked at it directly. No edge disturbance. When you walk in firm snow, your boot edge disturbs the snow crystals at the margin of the print, a subtle fractured zone that rings each impression. It is caused by the lateral force of a foot compressing and slightly displacing material as it transfers weight. Our prints had that disturbance, consistent throughout the crossing. The middle prints did not. They were pressed cleanly, as if applied from above, with uniform downward pressure, perfectly formed boot sole shapes, with no weight transfer mechanics in evidence, no heel strike deepening at the back, no toe-off disturbance at the front, no edge fracture at any margin. They looked exactly like boot prints. They had been made by nothing that walks. We filed an incident report through the satellite communicator to the gates of the Arctic Visitor Center in Coldfoot when we reached our pickup point 4 days later. The ranger who debriefed us was a man named Officer Vance, a 15-year Parks veteran who had worked the Brooks Range longer than either of us had been doing Alaska backcountry. He listened to the full account. He asked Cole to describe the print characteristics in detail, which Cole did with the same precision he had applied to observing them. Officer Vance wrote it all down. He told us there had been a prior report 18 months earlier from a solo backpacker traversing a similar route in the Central Brooks. That person had reported a sustained sense of being followed over 2 days, a figure seen at distance on 3 separate occasions, and on the final morning, a single set of prints in the snow patch on a ridgeline that had not been there when they had crossed that snow 4 hours earlier. He said the prior report had been logged and forwarded to the park's resource management team and to a federal liaison office he identified only by its agency designation, which I did not recognize. Our report was logged under case number GAA2208-CB4. It was forwarded to the same office. We have not heard back. Cole and I are planning a trip to the White Mountains north of Fairbanks next summer, not the Brooks Range. I am not ready to go back to the Brooks Range, and I have been honest with Cole about that, and he has understood without requiring explanation. He found the prints as disturbing as I did. He is an engineer, and he exhausted the explanations, and the explanations did not hold. That matters to him. He is not a person who is comfortable with things that do not hold up under analysis, and what we found on that snowfield does not hold up under analysis. He is taking some time with that. Officer Vance, when we left the Coldfoot Visitor Center, said one thing that I have thought about many times since. He said that the Central Brooks Range above treeline is one of the least traveled regions in North America, and that the incident reports they received from it were infrequent, but that the ones they did receive tended to have consistent features. He mentioned the sensation of being followed. He mentioned shadows. He mentioned prints without origin points. He said he had been working that country for 15 years and that he believed the reports were accurate accounts of genuine experiences. He said it carefully and he did not elaborate beyond it, and I respected both the saying of it and the not elaborating. In deep remote terrain with no other parties and no infrastructure, if you find physical evidence of a third presence in snow or soft ground that has no origin point, prints that begin in the middle of your own trail without preceding impressions on the approach, do not search for the Source: do not backtrack. Do not attempt to identify whatever made them. Make your position report on the satellite communicator. Move directly to your extraction point, and do not make camp again in that drainage. Whatever traveled between Cole and me on that snowfield had been with us before the snow. The snow was just where we could finally see it. And if the shadow I saw on the afternoon of day 8 was real, if there was already something between us then, walking our pace, matching our stride, it had been with us for at least 14 hours before we found the evidence. Pay attention to your shadow count. It should match your party size. On open tundra in directional light, check it. If the count is wrong, do not stop to investigate. Do not look for what is causing it. Move toward people and light without delay, and do not slow down until you are somewhere with other human beings present. Whatever was between us on that snowfield, it had been tracking our pace and our route since at least the afternoon before. It had learned us. It knew exactly how far apart to walk to stay centered between us. That is not an accident. That is familiarity. And familiarity of that kind, in terrain that remote, should concern you more than anything loud or sudden ever could. Story 10, what the radio recorded. This comes from a Coast Guard auxiliary incident log. The vessel was found. The crew was not. What the radio recorded before the signal died is what I'm here to tell you about. I want to be careful about how I share this because the families of the people involved are still living, and because the official record says something different from what people in the auxiliary know happened. The official record is not wrong about the facts. It is incomplete about what the facts mean. I am going to give you the rest. I served 12 years as a Coast Guard auxiliary volunteer out of the Station Sitka detachment on Baranof Island, and in that time I participated in or supported 37 search and rescue operations on the waters of Southeast Alaska. I am telling you this so you understand that I am not a person who is easily disturbed by difficult things. I have seen what the North Pacific does to vessels and to people, and I carry that weight the way everyone in SAR work carries it, filed, managed, present in a specific part of the memory that you learn to access only when necessary. The waters around Baranof Island are some of the most technically demanding in North American SAR. The channels between the islands of Southeast Alaska are subject to tidal currents that can run at 6 knots through narrow passes. The weather comes off the Gulf of Alaska with almost no warning time, and the combination of cold water temperature and distance from services means that outcomes in casualty situations are often decided before the rescue assets can reach the scene. The people who work those waters commercially and recreationally are by and large experienced and appropriately cautious. The ones who are not do not tend to stay in that business long. Mr. Harmon was one of the careful ones. That is the part that has always stayed with me. The case I am going to describe involved a 26-foot aluminum fishing vessel registered out of Sitka to a man I will call Mr. Harmon. He ran the boat commercially in season and recreationally off-season, and he was an experienced mariner who had worked those waters for 19 years. On a Friday evening in early October of 2013, Mr. Harmon left the Sitka small boat harbor at approximately 5 p.m. with 2 crew members, his adult nephew, and a longtime fishing partner named Walt, bound for a halibut anchor site he had worked many times before in the waters southeast of Kruzof Island. The weather when they departed was manageable. 3 to 4 foot swells from the southwest, 10 to 15 knot winds, visibility about 2 miles in intermittent rain and mist. Not comfortable conditions for a small vessel, but conditions Mr. Harmon had operated in many times, and the anchor site was less than 2 hours' run from the harbor. They never arrived at the anchor site, and they never came back. At 11 p.m., when the harbor contact that Mr. Harmon had arranged a practice he always followed on night trips, a scheduled check-in every 2 hours, received no response to the first contact attempt. They waited 15 minutes and tried again. No response. They called the Coast Guard station at 11:30. The EPIRB registered aboard the vessel had already activated at 9:47 p.m., transmitting from a position approximately 11 miles southwest of their intended destination and about 14 miles from the nearest shoreline. The station had already launched. Coast Guard Station Sitka launched immediately, and auxiliary was called to support the search at first light. By the time I reached the search area at 7 the following morning, the active unit had already located the vessel. It was floating, upright, engine off, anchor deployed, riding the swell in good trim with no visible hull damage. No one aboard. I am going to give you that again because it matters. The vessel was found in good condition at anchor with no damage and no distress evident, and it was empty. 3 experienced men had departed in that boat, and the boat was intact, and nobody was in it or near it. The EPIRB activation that had triggered the search had been initiated manually, not by capsize or water immersion, as would happen in a casualty, but by someone on board pressing the button deliberately and holding it for the required activation time. Someone had chosen to activate it. The people aboard had communicated distress and then were simply gone from a boat that showed no sign of the distress that would explain their absence. I will not discuss in detail the search that followed, out of respect for the families. What I will tell you is that it was extensive and it was thorough, and it did not produce answers. No bodies were recovered. No gear was found in the water. No explanation was established for why 3 people had activated an emergency beacon and then ceased to exist while their boat sat intact at anchor in 14 miles of open ocean. The incident was logged under case number SAR AUX 1310-SIT. It is in the public record. You can find the summary if you know where to look. It says what official summaries say: position of EPIRB activation, assets deployed, area searched, persons not recovered. It is accurate in every stated fact. What is not in the summary is the radio recording. The recording exists. I am certain of that because I know the 2 people who listened to it, and neither of them had any reason to invent what they described. One of them, the year after that case closed, transferred to a desk assignment and has not requested field rotation since. The other continued field work but told me once, quietly, that he no longer monitors Channel 16 on night operations without feeling something he could not name settle into the room. What is not in the summary is that the voice on the recording was recognized. Both reviewers said the same thing, separately. The voice that had called Mr. Harmon's name across Channel 16 that October night sounded like Mr. Harmon himself, his own voice calling his own name from the dark water north of where his vessel was anchored. His voice, emptied of everything that made it his, preserved only in its technical shape and using that shape to call him out into the night. The vessel's VHF radio had a built-in continuous recording function that was activated any time the squelch broke any. Time a signal came through the radio, the system recorded it automatically, storing a rolling 12-hour archive on a compact flash card in the unit. When the Coast Guard boarded the vessel, the radio was still powered. The card was pulled as part of standard evidence collection. I was not in the room when the recordings were first reviewed, but I know 2 of the people who were. Both of them told me the same thing independently. Both of them were experienced SAR professionals who had reviewed vessel evidence recordings many times before. Both of them said the same words in describing their reaction. They had needed to leave the room. The recordings from the final 2 hours of the vessel's occupied period, the last 2 hours, before the EPIRB activated, captured the following sequence. I am giving you this from the accounts of the 2 people who reviewed it, both of whom I have known for many years, neither of whom had any interest in embellishing what they heard. I am also giving it to you because I believe you have a right to know that what happened to Mr. Harmon and his crew was not an accident, and that the water off Kruzof Island on an October night is not simply water for the first 40 minutes after their arrival at the anchor site, normal radio traffic. Mr. Harmon's voice giving position updates to the harbor contact at the standard intervals he always used. Walt's voice, briefly, reporting the anchor was set and the boat was riding well. Background sounds consistent with a small vessel at anchor in moderate conditions, the slap of chop against the hull, the mechanical sound of the windlass, rain on the pilothouse roof, the occasional creak of the vessel working in the swell. Everything normal, everything accounted for. 3 experienced men at a familiar anchor site on a manageable night, doing what they had done many times before. Then, at a point approximately 90 minutes before the EPIRB activated, the normal sounds of a boat at anchor stopped. Not abruptly, they faded, the way ambient sound fades when something closer and more immediate claims attention. And into that shift, the radio recorded something that was not a transmission from the vessel, but was being received by it, a voice on channel 16, the international distress and calling channel, that said Mr. Harmon's full name. His given name first, his surname second, clearly and with the specific weight of someone who knows a person, rather than someone who is hailing a stranger. Just his name, twice. Then silence. 2 of the people who reviewed the recording described the voice independently, and their descriptions matched in every specific. It was similar to Mr. Harmon's own voice, the same general register, the same regional inflection he carried from the area he had grown up in. But it was wrong in a way both reviewers found deeply difficult to articulate. Empty was the word one of them used. The other said hollow. The same shape as a voice that had lived in a body for decades, but without whatever it is that living in a body for decades puts into a voice. Flat in the way of a recording, each generation of copy losing something of the original until what remains is technically accurate and humanly absent. Mr. Harmon's voice responded on the recording. He said yes. He said who's there. He said it in a tone that both reviewers described identically, wary and alert. The voice of an experienced mariner who had encountered something unexpected on a frequency he was monitoring and was approaching it with caution rather than alarm. The tone of a careful man. The voice on the channel said his full name again. Then it said that there was something in the water that needed help. It did not say what. It said the position approximately a quarter mile to the northeast of the vessel's current location, with a specific confidence of something that knew exactly where the vessel was anchored and exactly where it was in relation to it. It gave a bearing, it gave a distance. Both, as best as could be reconstructed from subsequent search data, were accurate. Both reviewers said the same thing about this part of the recording. It sounded like a distress call from someone who knew Mr. Harmon personally, not a stranger's voice flagging a generic emergency. A voice using his name, giving him specific information, asking him to come. There was a pause on the recording of about 40 seconds, the sound of the anchor being weighed, the engine turning over, catching, running, the vessel's motion changing from the rolling of a boat at anchor to the purposeful movement of a boat underway. Mr. Harmon moved his vessel northeast. The EPIRB activated 51 minutes after the vessel began. Moving. In 51 minutes, traveling at the vessel's typical running speed, in those conditions, a boat can cover a considerable distance. Enough distance that what they encountered could have been well beyond the shoreline, in open, exposed water, with nothing between them and the Gulf of Alaska. After the EPIRB activation, there were 11 more minutes of recording before the card archived over 11 minutes of the empty vessel at anchor, the Coast Guard hailing on Channel 16, and no human voice in response. Just the static of an open channel and the sounds of a small boat riding a swell alone in the dark. After the EPIRB activation, there were 11 more minutes of recording before the card's archive rolled forward and the pre-activation content was overwritten 11 minutes of the empty vessel at anchor. Transmissions from the Coast Guard station acknowledging the EPIRB and hailing the vessel, and no response. The radio recorded the search beginning. The radio recorded the silence where 3 men used to be. The voice on Channel 16 that had said Mr. Harmon's name and directed the vessel northeast, it was not recorded in the Coast Guard station logs for that evening. Nothing had transmitted on Channel 16 from that area at that time in the official record. Whatever had been broadcasting on that frequency had been received by the vessel's radio and nowhere else. The official finding in the case is 3 persons missing. Presumed drowned following accidental man overboard event. Cause undetermined. It is a compassionate finding. It closes the case. It gives the families a category. It does not explain the empty, intact, anchored vessel. It does not explain the voice on the recording. It does not explain what moved north of the vessel in the dark water of southeast Alaska on that October night and used a dead man's own voice to call him toward it. The official finding does not mention the voice on the recording. It could not, because the voice on the recording had no explanation that the official finding was equipped to contain. I understand that. I spent years being frustrated about it before I came to understand it. The people who write official findings are working within a system that has categories: capsizing, man overboard, engine failure. Weather casualty and what happened to Mr. Harmon and his crew does not fit any of those categories. The official finding is the best the system could do with what it had, and I no longer blame the system for its limits. The limits are real. What I do blame, quietly and privately, is the assumption that those limits define what is possible. The assumption that because the official finding has no category for what the recording contains, the recording must be wrong. It is not wrong. It is the clearest documentation of what happened that exists, and it sits in an archive somewhere, correctly labeled as evidence from a closed case, and almost nobody who has access to it will listen to it again. I finished my auxiliary service 4 years after that case. I gave 12 years, and I am proud of every hour of it. But I no longer go on the water after dark in those channels. I will not take a night charter. I will not anchor out in the exposed water south of Cruzoff Island, regardless of conditions or who is asking. Other volunteers I respect have made different choices and continued working those waters for years since. I do not question their courage or their judgment. Everyone who knows what the recording contains makes their own accounting. Mine changed that October. The water off Cruzoff Island at night is not simply water. Take that for what it is worth. If you are on a vessel at anchor after dark in remote water and you receive a voice call on the distress channel that uses your name, your specific name, your full name, offered with the confidence of something that has been close enough to learn it, do not respond. Do not confirm your position. Do not move the vessel toward whatever direction it suggests. Whatever uses that channel in the dark water of southeast Alaska is not in distress. It does not need assistance. It knows exactly where you are, and it is asking you to come to it. Stay at anchor. Wait for daylight. Keep every light on the vessel burning. And in the morning, leave. Whatever is in the water off Cruzoff Island has been there longer than the charts. It knows those channels, and it knows the anchor sites, and it knows how to use a name and a bearing and the specific tone of distress that a careful, responsible mariner cannot ignore. Mr. Harmon was a careful man. He heard someone who sounded like someone he knew asking for help, and he went. That is who he was. That is what it used. Do not answer a voice call on the distress channel after dark in those waters that uses your name before you have identified yourself. Do not move your vessel toward a position given by a voice you cannot verify. A genuine distress caller does not know your name. A genuine distress caller does not give you a bearing with the precision of something that has been watching your position all evening. Stay at anchor. Keep every light running. Wait for the sun. Don't answer. If you made it through all 10 of these tonight, I want to say thank you. Genuinely. You could be anywhere, and you chose to spend these hours here in the dark listening. That means something to me. Stay safe out there.